Hey you! Yes, you the one who just got comfortable, pulled the blanket a little higher and decided that tonight instead of doom scrolling, you would let someone tell you a story. That is a genuinely excellent decision, and I am really glad you are here. Welcome back, friend. Let me ask you something before we begin. When you think about the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Knights in shining armour, castles rising from misty hillsides, kings sitting on golden thrones making decisions that changed the course of history. Sure, all of that was real. But here is what nobody talks about. The armour on that knight. Somebody made it by hand, piece by piece, in a smoky workshop before the sun came up. The castle on that hill. Somebody cut every single stone, hauled it, shaped it, and set it in place with nothing but muscle and memory and tools they had spent years learning how to use. And the throne. Somebody carved it. Somebody polished it. Somebody showed up to work that morning, saw back calloused hands, probably a little hungry, and made it beautiful. Those people did not have names in the history books. They did not ride horses into battle or sign treaties. They just built the world, quietly, every single day. Tonight we're going to talk about them. If tonight's story moves you, if it makes you see something in history you have never noticed before, it would mean the world to me if you took just a moment to like this video and subscribe. And if you are already a subscriber, you are one of my favourite people and you know it. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from right now? Are you in bed on the couch in some cozy corner with a cup of something warm? I genuinely want to know. Now, let us dim the room just a little more, settle in, and let the story carry you. Picture this. Northern France. The year's somewhere around 1240. The town of Troyes, famous for its wool markets, its trade fairs, its narrow streets that smell like wood smoke and wet stone, and bread baking somewhere in the distance. It is not yet 4 a.m. The town is silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the far-off sound of a church bell marking the hours. Most of the world is asleep, but in a low stone building on the edge of the market quarter there is already a faint orange glow pressing through the cracks in the shuttered window. Someone is awake. His name, let us say, is William, a blacksmith. 34 years old, which in the 13th century makes him solidly middle-aged. He has a beard that has seen better days, a left thumb that no longer bends quite right, after an incident with a mallet 3 years ago, and a daughter who just turned 5 and has already decided she's running the household. William is not special. That is exactly the point. He is one of tens of thousands of craftsmen scattered across medieval Europe, in England and France, in the German territories, in the Italian city-states, who woke up every single morning before the birds did and got to work making the things that held civilization together. Now, before we go any further, I want to gently push back on something. Because when most people think about who built the medieval world, they think about two groups: the people with power and the people without it, the lords and the peasants, the rulers and the ruled, and the craftsmen, the artisans, the tradespeople, the skilled workers. They kind of get lost somewhere in the middle. Not glamorous enough for a legend, not miserable enough to be a cautionary tale. But here is what the historical record actually tells us, and this is the part that always catches people off guard. In many medieval towns by the 13th century, skilled craftsmen and artisans made up anywhere from 20 to 50% of the entire urban population. In some German towns like Nordlingen, scholars have found that as many as 4 out of every 5 taxed residents were craftsmen of one kind or another. 4 out of 5. That is not a supporting cast. That is the main event. These were the people who kept towns running not just with hammers and looms, but with knowledge, with expertise passed down so carefully, so jealously, so deliberately, that it took years, sometimes a decade, just to earn the right to practice it independently. And yet most of us have never stopped to ask, what was a Tuesday actually like for one of these people? What did they eat for breakfast? What time did they start? What were they afraid of? What made them proud? That is what we are here to find out. Let us go back to William for a moment. His workshop, which is also in many ways his living room, his office, his identity, and his entire financial future, rolled into one, sits at the edge of town, close enough to the market to attract customers, far enough from the nicer streets that nobody has to smell the charcoal burning all day. The house itself is modest by any standard. 2 rooms, one main room where the hearth is where meals happen, where apprentices sleep on the floor near the warmth. One smaller room in the back where William and his wife sleep, and where little Marjorie currently occupies far more space than a 5-year-old has any right to. The workshop is attached directly to the house, a large low-ceilinged room dominated by the forge, the anvil, and the collection of tools hanging on the walls that William has spent 15 years accumulating, some of them inherited from his own father, some of them made by his own hand. This is not unusual. For most medieval craftsmen, the line between home and work simply did not exist. You lived where you laboured. You raised your children in the smell of your trade. Your wife knew your customers by name. Your apprentice heard you argue with your wife through a wall that was honestly not very thick. It was intimate. It was exhausting. And in its own strange way, it was a kind of life that very few people in the modern world have ever actually experienced. Now here is a question that I find genuinely fascinating. Who were these craftsmen and how did they fit into the world they lived in? Because the medieval social order, what scholars sometimes call the 3 estates, was famously rigid. You had those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Clergy, nobility, and everyone else. And the everyone else category covered an enormous range of lives. From the starving peasant who owned nothing and owed everything to the prosperous master craftsman who owned his workshop, employed several men, belonged to a powerful guild, and might on a very good year earn more than a minor country knight. The craft workers occupied this fascinating, complicated middle ground. They were not nobles. They had no inherited land. They had no titles. But they had something that in the right time and place was just as valuable. They had a skill that nobody could take from them. A blacksmith carried his knowledge in his hands and his eyes and his instincts. A master weaver understood in her bones the tension of every thread. A stonemason could look at a block of rough limestone and see already the precise angle of the cut required. That knowledge was theirs, permanently, irreversibly. And in a world where your worth was usually determined entirely by who your father was that was quietly, powerfully revolutionary, there is something else worth understanding about this world, and I think it matters more than most history books let on. The medieval town that William lived in, Troy, in our story, but it could have been York or Bruges or Cologne or Florence, was small, extraordinarily small by our standards. London, the largest city in England, had perhaps 18,000 people in the year 1086, according to the Domesday Book. By the 14th century, that number had grown to roughly 45,000, and that was the biggest city in the country. Most towns had between 2,000 and 5,000 people, total. Imagine genuinely knowing almost everyone in your town. Knowing the baker by her laugh. Knowing the tanner by the smell that followed him everywhere, which, bless him, was not a pleasant smell. Knowing which streets were safe after dark and which ones really were not. In that kind of world, your reputation was not just important. It was everything. A craftsman who produced shoddy work did not just lose a customer. He lost his standing, his ability to attract apprentices, his relationship with the guild, his wife's willingness to brag about him at the market, which mattered more than people admitted. Quality was not a business strategy. It was a survival mechanism. And the guild system, the extraordinary, complicated, occasionally infuriating network of professional associations that governed medieval craft work, existed precisely to enforce that. to make sure that every horseshoe was sound, every bolt of cloth was what it claimed to be, every loaf of bread weighed what the law said it should weigh. We will spend a lot of time with the guilds later in our journey because there is so much there. Politics, corruption, brotherhood, cruelty, and genuine genius all tangled up together. But for now, just know this. By the 13th century, virtually every craft and trade in every large medieval town had its own guild. Cloth makers, candle makers, armourers, carpenters, stonemasons, goldsmiths, bakers, even surgeons eventually, who were considered tradesmen because they had learned their skills through apprenticeship rather than at a university. These organisations were not optional, and they were not gentle. Back in the workshop, William is stoking the forge. He does this the same way every morning, carefully, methodically, in an order he has followed so many times it requires no conscious thought. Charcoal first, then the bellows, slow and steady, coaxing the heat rather than forcing it. He has learned through burned fingers and ruined iron and one memorable disaster involving a pot that was supposed to be a cauldron and ended up being something that nobody could quite identify. He has learned that fire does not respond well to impatience. Neither, as it turns out, does anything worth making. The light from the forge fills the low room with a warm pulsing glow. Outside, the sky's beginning to shift from black to the very deep blue that comes just before dawn. In an hour, the market bells will ring, the town will start to stir, and the first customers may appear at the workshop door. William has a long list of things to finish. 3 ploughshares that the Dubois farm has been waiting on for 2 weeks. A set of hinges for the new door at the church on St. Anthony's Street. 6 nails, always nails, endlessly nails. The medieval world ran on nails for a carpenter 2 streets over who keeps promising to settle his account, and keeps with remarkable creativity finding reasons not to, and somewhere in the back of his mind a small persistent worry about the iron supply which is getting low, and the merchant who brings it who is due any day now, and whose prices have been going up in a way that is starting to feel less like the market and more like a personal vendetta. This is the life. Not the romantic version, not the legend. The actual daily unglamorous, occasionally maddening, genuinely skilled, deeply human life of a person who made things for a living in a world where making things by hand was the only option anyone had ever known. And here is the part that I keep coming back to, the part that made me want to tell this story in the first place. We look back at the Middle Ages and we see all the darkness, the plague, the wars, the rigid hierarchies, the genuine suffering that was woven into ordinary life. And all of that was real. We are not going to pretend otherwise. But we also very often miss the texture of it. The small details, the humour and the tenderness and the stubborn, ordinary dignity of people who got up every morning and did difficult things with their hands and were proud of what they made. A study of craft records from 13th century England found references to craftsmen who signed their work not with their names, which many of them could not write, but with small distinctive marks. A particular curve stamped into leather, a specific pattern worked into the edge of a blade, a tiny symbol scratched into the base of a pot, a signature in the language available to them, which means that even 800 years ago someone thought, this is mine. I made this. I want anyone who holds it to know that someone cared about getting it right. That is not so different from us, is it? So tonight and in the nights that follow, we are going to step all the way inside that world. We are going to follow the craft worker from before sunrise to after sunset. We are going to understand the system that shaped their lives, the guilds, the apprenticeships, the extraordinary demands of the masterpiece. We are going to meet the women who worked alongside the men and were largely written out of the story. We are going to look honestly at what the guild system got right and what it got terribly wrong. And we're going to ask at the very end a question that I think is more interesting than it first appears. What would a master craftsman from the year 1240 think of the world we have built? And what might he think of us? but that is for later. Right now William has a forge to tend. The bellows need working. The day has not yet fully begun, and there is iron to shape. And in just a little while we're going to follow him through the door of the workshop and find out what it really took to survive and thrive and leave something lasting behind in the world of the medieval craft worker. Stay with me. There is a particular kind of morning that most of us have forgotten. Not the slow, comfortable kind, the one where you reach for your phone check. A few things maybe lie there another 10 minutes, deciding if you actually need to get up. No, I mean the other kind. The kind that did not ask permission. The kind that arrived like a hand on your shoulder before the sky had made up its mind what colour it wanted to be. For a medieval apprentice, that morning came every single day, without exception, without negotiation, and it started in most cases before the boy or sometimes girl had even finished growing. Let us stay in that world for a while, because what happened to these children is one of the most fascinating, complicated, and honestly rather heartbreaking chapters in the entire history of how people learn to make things. Here is how it began. You're somewhere between 7 and 15 years old. Let us say 12, which was common enough. Your father is a peasant farmer outside of York, or a minor tradesman in Ghent, or perhaps he died 2 winters ago, and your mother has been managing on very little ever since. Someone in the family knows someone, a neighbour, a distant cousin, a man at the market who has a reputation for producing decent leather goods. And one day a conversation happens quietly, practically the way financial decisions are always made when money is scarce, and an agreement is reached. Your parents will pay a small fee to place you in the care of a master craftsman. In return, this craftsman will feed you, clothe you in basic woolens, provide you a place to sleep, and teach you everything he knows about his trade. Over the next 7 years. 7 years. You're 12. 7 years from now you will be 19. Which means that from this point forward, the entirety of your adolescence, every restless, uncertain, growing inch of it belongs to someone else. You do not get a vote, nobody asked you. The contract that formalized this arrangement was called an indenture. The name comes from the Latin word for tooth, which I find rather evocative given the circumstances, because the document was literally serrated along one edge, written out twice on the same sheet of parchment, then cut apart in a jagged line so that the two halves could only be verified as authentic by matching the torn edges together like a puzzle. The earliest surviving examples of these contracts in England date from the 13th century, and they are extraordinary documents if you take the time to read what they actually say. On one side of the agreement, the master promised to provide instruction in his craft, to supply food and lodging, and to clothe the apprentice in suitable garments. Fair enough. On the other side, the apprentice's side, or more accurately the side his parents signed on his behalf, since the boy himself rarely had any legal standing in the matter, the obligations were considerably more comprehensive. The apprentice was bound to follow his master's orders without question. He was forbidden from visiting taverns. He was not permitted to play dice or any games of chance. He could not marry, could not become engaged, could not pursue any romantic involvement whatsoever. He was required to keep his master's business secrets absolutely confidential. He was not to absent himself from his master's service day or night without explicit permission. Read that list again slowly. That is not a job contract. That is the terms of a life compressed into parchment, sealed with wax and handed to a stranger. Now, I want to be fair here, and this matters because the instinct when reading medieval history is often to slide straight into horror, which is satisfying but not always accurate. The reality of apprenticeship was considerably more textured than either the romantic version or the nightmare version suggests. Most masters, according to historical records, did develop something genuinely paternal toward their apprentices. Court records from medieval London and York describe masters who left money to their apprentices in their wills. Some apprentices eventually married their master's daughters. Some were treated by all available evidence as near members of the family. The medieval home was not a private sanctuary the way we think of home today. It was a working unit. The master's wife managed the household. The journeyman slept in the main room near the hearth. The children of the family ran underfoot alongside the apprentices. Everyone ate together. Everyone was in some functional sense part of the same enterprise, and within that arrangement real affection was possible, even common. And here is the part that requires us to sit with some discomfort. Real cruelty was also possible, also common. Court records from the same period are equally full of cases where masters beat their apprentices with what the courts considered excessive force. Cases where boys were given inadequate food, denied proper clothing through harsh winters, worked hours that left them hollow-eyed and barely functional. Cases where apprentices simply ran away, vanished into the anonymity of a city that was, if you were clever and desperate enough, large enough to lose yourself in. Running away from your indenture was a serious offence. If caught, you could be brought back by force. Your parents might lose the fee they had paid. Your future within any guild in that city could be permanently closed, and yet they ran. Enough of them ran that the records mention it routinely, which tells you something quietly devastating about what some of those workshops must have felt like from the inside. So what did the actual days look like? Let us follow a specific kind of apprentice, a boy taken on by a weaver in 13th century Flanders, where the textile industry was arguably the most economically powerful craft sector in all of Northern Europe. He wakes before his master. This is not optional. It is one of the unspoken rules that apprentices absorbed within the first week. The first one up tends the fire, brings water, sweeps the workshop floor from the previous day's debris threads, scraps of fleece, whatever accumulated during the hours of work. His master will arrive to find the loom already uncovered, the shuttles organised, the raw wool sorted by quality and grade. If he does not find these things, there will be consequences. Not necessarily dramatic ones, more likely the quiet, erosive kind. An extra task added. A dinner portion slightly reduced. A comment made in a tone that lands somewhere between criticism and contempt. This is the early phase of an apprenticeship, and during this phase the boy does almost no actual weaving. That surprises people. We imagine the apprentice learning the craft from day one, hands on the loom skill transferring like electricity. But the reality was far more patient and far more strategic. The early months, sometimes the early years, were spent doing everything except the craft itself. Fetching and carrying, cleaning tools, running errands to the dye merchants or the wool traders, watching, always watching. The master was not being cruel in withholding direct instruction. He was at least in theory following a deliberate pedagogical logic. You learn to see before you learn to do. You understand the materials before you touch them. You absorb the rhythm of a workshop before you contribute to it. Whether or not this logic was always sound, it was universal. A study of medieval guild practices found the same pattern across trades as different as goldsmithing, masonry, shoemaking and candle making. The apprentice was a vessel that filled slowly, sometimes very slowly. Here is something worth pausing on because I think it reveals something interesting about how the medieval mind understood mastery. We live in an era of acceleration. You can watch a tutorial and attempt to skill the same afternoon. You can practice coding for 6 months and get a job. The rhythm of modern skill acquisition is fast by design. There is economic pressure to compress learning to produce competent people quickly. Medieval guild culture went in almost precisely the opposite direction. 7 years was the standard, and in skilled trades like goldsmithing or fine metalwork it could stretch to 10. The explicit reasoning was quality. The implicit reasoning, and this is the part guilds were less keen to advertise, was control. An apprenticeship that lasted 7 years produced, yes, a highly skilled craftsman. It also produced an adult who had spent the most formative years of his life inside a single system of values, habits and loyalties, who knew instinctively what the guild expected and why, who had internalized standards of quality not just as rules to follow, but as something closer to personal conviction. Think about that for a moment. It is actually quite sophisticated, and it raises a question I find genuinely interesting. Is that so different from the way any institution, a university, a corporation, a military shapes the people who pass through it? By the middle years of the apprenticeship, things began to shift. The boy was older now. His hands had learned what his mind could not yet articulate, the specific pressure needed to keep a consistent tension on the thread, the subtle reading of a flame's colour to judge the exact moment iron becomes workable. He had been watching for years. He had been practicing quietly in stolen moments, repeating small gestures until they became reflexive. And gradually the master began to show him things, not all at once, not generously. The transmission of knowledge in a medieval workshop had a quality that I can only describe as deliberately incomplete. A master showed you what you needed to know to do the next task. He did not show you everything he knew, the full depth of the craft, the genuinely proprietary techniques, the small innovations a particular master had developed over decades. Those remained sealed, revealed only at the master's discretion. Sometimes only at the end of the apprenticeship, sometimes not at all. The guild had rules about this. Masters were required to instruct their apprentices. But what counted as instruction, and how thorough it needed to be, left enormous room for interpretation. And masters, being human beings with their own economic interests, some of them interpreted that room quite generously in their own favour. There is a particular document from 14th century London, a complaint filed with the city authorities by a group of former apprentices against a goldsmith named Robert de Brendewode, in which the men alleged that their master had deliberately taught them only the least valuable parts of his trade, keeping the finest techniques to himself, so that none of them could ever become genuine competitors. The city investigated. The outcome of the case is unfortunately lost to time. But the fact that the complaint existed at all tells us something important. Apprentices were not passive recipients of whatever their masters chose to give them. They knew what they were owed. They were watching carefully. And when they felt cheated, they said so. Now let us talk about something that the romantic version of apprenticeship almost always leaves out: the social dimension. Because these children did not arrive in workshops as blank slates. They arrived with families, with loyalties, with the accumulated weight of wherever they had come from. And then they spent 7 years inside a system that asked them to set all of that aside. Think about what it means to leave home at 12, to sleep in a stranger's workshop on a straw pallet near the hearth, with the sounds of someone else's family moving through the walls, to eat at someone else's table under someone else's rules, eating food that was often, not always, but often noticeably less than what the master's own children received. A study of medieval Montpellier, which analysed roughly 450 work contracts from the period spanning around 1300 to 1500, found that 60% of apprentices in the city were immigrants, rural children who had moved to the city specifically to find training, which means that for the majority of these young people, apprenticeship was not just vocational. It was the defining experience of becoming a stranger in a new place, of building an identity from scratch in unfamiliar surroundings, with very little certainty about what the future held. That is an enormous thing to ask of a child. And yet, and this is the part that moves me honestly, many of them did it. Many of them stayed. Many of them absorbed the blows, literal and otherwise, and came out the other side with a skill that was entirely their own. A capability that no lord could tax and no plague could immediately take. Something they had earned in the most precise and physical sense of that word, with their own hands and their own years. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the apprenticeship, and then we will leave it for now. At the end of 7 years, or however long the term lasted, there was typically a small ceremony. Not elaborate, not public. The master would formally declare the apprenticeship complete. The apprentice would receive a set of basic tools of his trade, sometimes clothing, sometimes a modest sum of money. He would be acknowledged in some way as having passed through, and then he was a journeyman, which sounds like a promotion, and in some ways it was. But in other ways it was a door opening into a different kind of uncertainty, one that in many ways was even harder than what had come before. Because now he was free, theoretically. He could work for any master willing to hire him. He could travel. He could practice his craft without asking anyone's permission for every small decision. But he could not yet open his own workshop, could not yet train apprentices of his own, could not yet call himself a master. And the path between journeyman and master, the path paved with one extraordinary object called a masterpiece, was far longer and far more treacherous than most people ever learned. That story's coming. But first let us follow this young man into the workshop on a regular morning, because we have spent so long understanding how he got there that we have not yet properly seen what he found inside. The forge is ready. The light is pale and slanting through the shutters, and for the first time his master has handed him the hammer. Let us see what he does with it. So the hammer is in his hands now. Let us stop there for just a moment, because I want us to actually feel what that means, rather than just picture it as a scene from a movie. A hammer in the hands of a young medieval craftsman was not merely a tool. It was something closer to a declaration, an announcement to the world and to himself that after years of watching and sweeping and carrying and being told to wait, the waiting was over. But before we follow William into the full heat of a working day, we need to understand something that most history books skim right past. The morning itself, the first hours in that workshop. Because what happened between the moment the fire was lit and the moment the first customer arrived was not just preparation. It was in many ways the entire philosophy of medieval craftwork compressed into a few quiet hours. And those hours, as it turns out, were governed by something that William had no control over whatsoever. The sun. The medieval workday was quite literally a creature of light. Guilds across Europe, from the embroiderers of Paris to the metalworkers of Nuremberg to the clothmakers of Bruges, had one rule that appeared in almost identical language in virtually every set of craft regulations that has survived into the modern era. It was stated plainly in the Paris Embroidery Guild regulations of the year 1292, and it went like this. No man or woman may work at this craft by candlelight, but only as long as daylight lasts. For work done at night cannot be so well or skillfully done as that done by day. That sentence sounds simple, but think about what it actually meant in practice. It meant that in midsummer, when the sky over northern France stayed bright until nearly 9 in the evening, a craftsman might work 16 hours. And in the dead of December, when daylight in those latitudes lasted perhaps 8 hours less, if the sky was grey and overcast, which it frequently was, that same craftsman might legally work less than half of that. The working day did not just vary, it shrank and expanded with the seasons like a living thing, and the guild was not apologetic about this. They were explicit: quality requires light. Do not argue with the sun. Anyone caught working by candlelight paid a fine. In Paris it was 2 sols, 12 deniers to the king, 12 deniers to the guild wardens. Not a ruinous amount, but not negligible either. The point was not primarily financial. The point was the principle. The guild was telling you your ambition does not override the physics of vision. There is something I genuinely find admirable in that, even if I cannot quite put my finger on why. Perhaps because we live in an age of relentless productivity, where the expectation is that you manufacture your own light and work past midnight if that is what the job requires. The medieval guild looked at that impulse and said, no, the eye needs daylight, the hand needs to see what it is doing. The quality of the object matters more than the quantity you can produce. So William, our blacksmith in Troy, did not work by candlelight, but he was already awake long before the sun made any useful appearance. This is the part that does not fit neatly into the daylight-only rule, because the preparation for work, the unglamorous infrastructure of a craftsman's morning, began well before there was anything resembling useful light. And that preparation done correctly was the difference between a productive day and a frustrating one. The forge was the heart of everything, and the forge was not an instant thing. You could not simply strike a flint toss in some charcoal and start hammering 30 seconds later. Getting a forge to working temperature was a process that took time and attention, and the quality of that process shaped everything that followed. Charcoal was the standard fuel for medieval blacksmiths. Coal would not become common in English forges until the 17th century, partly because the sulfur content of coal made iron brittle and unpredictable. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner, and it was William's responsibility to ensure he had a reliable supply. This was itself no small logistical feat, because charcoal was produced by specialized workers called colliers, who ran controlled burns of timber in the forests outside the towns, a process that took days and had to be managed with extraordinary care. Good charcoal was consistent and essential, and its cost was a permanent line item in a blacksmith's budget, somewhere between unavoidable and painful. The fire itself was fed by bellows, large leather devices that compressed and pushed air into the base of the forge, intensifying the heat. Getting the bellows rhythm right was its own skill. Too slow, and the fire drifted below working temperature. Too fast, and you wasted fuel and risked overheating the iron unevenly. The ideal was a steady, measured rhythm, almost meditative if you were in the right mood for it. And then you waited and watched. Here is where the craft of blacksmithing becomes genuinely extraordinary to understand, and where I think the modern world has lost something important. William could not use a thermometer. He had no gauge, no dial, no digital display telling him that his forge had reached the correct temperature. What he had was his eyes and a knowledge of fire that has been building in him since the day he first stood next to a forge as a child. Iron tells you its temperature through colour. As it heats, it moves through a spectrum. Black iron goes first to a dull red, workable, barely for the crudest shaping, then bright red, then orange, then a brilliant, almost painful yellow-white at the highest temperatures where forge welding became possible, where two pieces of iron pressed together under a hammer would fuse into a single piece. Knowing which colour meant what and what could be done with the metal at each stage was not something you read about. It was something you absorbed, slowly, across years, until the colours became instinct rather than knowledge, till your hands were already moving toward the anvil at exactly the right moment. Not because you had thought it through, but because your body had learned the answer, before your brain had finished asking the question. That kind of knowing, embodied knowledge, some scholars call it, is genuinely difficult to describe and essentially impossible to teach through instruction alone. You cannot write it in a book. You cannot demonstrate it with a diagram. It lives in the body of the person who has done it 10,000 times, and it transfers only through sustained proximity, through years of watching someone who already has it, which is of course exactly why apprenticeships lasted as long as they did. Let us think for a moment about the variety of crafts that were going through this same essential morning ritual, all across a medieval town. Just down the lane from our blacksmith, a carpenter was unshuttering his windows and running a careful hand over the piece of timber he had left clamped overnight, checking that the glue joint had held properly. Carpenters worked with wood in a relationship that was in its own way just as intimate as a smith's relationship with fire. Timber moved, it expanded and contracted with humidity split along hidden grain lines, reacted differently to the same tool depending on its species and age. Understanding these behaviours was not academic, it was daily survival. A street away, a woman weaver was uncovering her horizontal loom and checking the warp threads she had set up the previous evening. The loom she worked at was a relatively recent technological innovation. The horizontal treadle loom operated with foot pedals that freed both hands, for the actual weaving had largely replaced earlier vertical warp-weighted looms in European urban centres by the 13th century. She placed her bench near the window specifically for light. Light-sensitive tasks, the fine colour work, the inspection of thread quality. The repair of broken warp threads had to be done in the morning hours before the light moved past the window and left her working in shadow. And somewhere on the edge of town, close enough to the river to access its water, a tanner was beginning his day in conditions that were frankly better left undescribed at length. The production of leather involved soaking animal hides in a vats of solution that included, among other things, oak bark, urine and water in various stages of fermentation. Tanners were officially required to locate their workshops at the edge of town precisely because the smell was considered a public nuisance, severe enough to merit its own municipal regulation. This was by any reasonable measure a reasonable regulation. 3 crafts, 3 completely different relationships with their materials, their light, their space. And yet the morning ritual was the same for all of them. Arrive early, prepare carefully, set the foundation for the hours ahead. One detail about medieval workshop mornings that I think gets dramatically underappreciated is the question of tools. We talk about craft knowledge as if it existed primarily in the craftsman's mind. But the truth is more physical than that. A significant part of the knowledge of any trade was encoded in the tools themselves, their particular balance, their specific weight, the degree to which their edges had been shaped and sharpened to suit the hands and habits of a single person. A medieval craftsman's tools were not interchangeable, they were deeply personal, passed down often from father to son or from master to favoured apprentice. Maintained with a devotion that would look excessive to modern eyes, because in a world where a good set of woodworking chisels or a quality set of metalworking hammers represented months or years of savings, the tools were genuinely irreplaceable. Every morning before work began, in earnest tools were inspected. Edges were checked for damage from the previous day's work. Wooden handles were examined for cracks. Leather straps and bindings were tested for looseness. This was not perfectionism for its own sake. A tool that failed at the wrong moment, a chisel that slipped because its handle had worked loose, a hammer whose head was not properly set, was not just an inconvenience. It was a hazard. Medieval workshops were places where fires burned, heavy iron moved through the air, and sharp things were in constant use. Carelessness in the morning inspection had a way of making itself known in the afternoon. Do you have a morning routine that you are careful about? Something small that, if skipped, tends to make the rest of the day slightly off. I would genuinely love to know. Drop it in the comments. I find these small rituals fascinating. Because what strikes me about medieval craftsmen is how deliberately they built their days. Not spontaneously, not reactively, but with this firm, settled intention that the beginning of the work shaped everything that came after it. By the time the first proper light was available, which in the 13th century climate of northern France or England meant something considerably softer and less dependable than what we might imagine, the workshop was ready. The fire was up to temperature. The tools were in their places. The apprentice had swept the floor of the previous day's debris. The materials for the day's orders were organised and accessible. And then the work began. Not slowly, not with ceremony, simply it began. Because the sun was not going to wait, and the light that was falling through that shuttered window was the most valuable resource William had, and he was not going to waste a minute of it. The blacksmith's morning was dominated by the heaviest, most demanding work. And this was not accidental. The logic of the medieval craftsman's schedule, which Oxford historian James Thorold Rogers observed in his studies of medieval labour records, was built around the simple fact that the body is strongest and most precise in the morning hours, when it is rested and the mind is clear. The most difficult, most consequential work came first, not because of a productivity philosophy, but because it was obvious. You do not attempt your finest work when your arms are already tired. For a blacksmith, the heavy forging, shaping ploughshares, bending structural pieces, drawing out long iron bars into usable rods happened in the morning. Finer work, the kind that required more precision than brute force, moved into the midday hours. By afternoon, fatigue was a factor you planned around rather than fought against. There is buried in that logic a lesson about human endurance that modern productivity culture keeps rediscovering and then immediately forgetting. Now I want to share something with you that I find quietly remarkable. The Paris Embroidery Guild regulations from 1292, the same document that banned working by candlelight, also included a rule that said in effect that no person could practice the craft of embroidery in Paris without having been verified as competent by the guild wardens. Not just trained, verified, inspected, approved. That verification happened not through a test or an examination in our modern sense. It happened through the guild warden walking into your workshop and looking at your work, handling it, judging the tension of the stitches, the regularity of the pattern, the quality of the underlying fabric. This is the inspection culture that ran through every medieval craft trade, the quiet, constant awareness that your work could at any moment be picked up and examined by someone whose entire professional identity was built around knowing exactly what good work looked like, and who would not hesitate to tell you publicly and with consequences if yours fell short. Guild inspectors made rounds, regularly, unannounced. Markets were patrolled, goods were tested, bakers' loaves were weighed, cloths were measured, metals were assayed. The system was imperfect, of course, the way any system run by humans is imperfect. There were bribes, there were blind eyes turned, there were inspectors who were more interested in collecting fines than in improving quality, but the principle underneath all of it was serious. And it was taken seriously. Every object that left a workshop and entered the world was a representation of the entire trade. One bad batch of cloth from a weaver in York reflected, however unfairly, on every other weaver in York. The guild's reputation was collective. The quality of your morning's work was not only your concern. As the first customer of the day appeared, perhaps it was the carpenter from 2 streets over, finally ready to collect those hinge fittings, William was already deep into his work. His hands were black with forge grime. His face was warm from the fire. The apprentice was working the bellows in the steady rhythm that William had spent 2 years teaching him to maintain. The transaction was brief, practical, personal. The carpenter knew William, had probably known him for years. This was not an anonymous commercial exchange. It was a conversation between 2 skilled people who understood without needing to say so exactly what the other's work involved. The hinge fittings were examined. They were good. The carpenter paid or promised to pay or offered a piece of timber in partial exchange, because cash was still far from universal in everyday medieval commerce, and the informal credit and barter networks that ran alongside the formal economy were how many small transactions actually worked. The carpenter left. William turned back to the forge, and the morning continued. Outside, the light was strengthening. The town was fully awake now. The market bells had rung. Somewhere nearby, the smell of bread from the baker's oven was drifting through the streets, the universal medieval signal that the day had properly begun. In the workshop, the hammer fell and fell and fell. There is one more thing about these morning hours that I want to leave with you because it has stayed with me ever since I first came across it. Historians studying medieval craft production have noted that many workshops followed a rhythm almost musical in its regularity, in which different tasks cycled around the constraints of the day: heavy work in the morning, lighter work in the midday. Administrative tasks dealing with suppliers, settling accounts, accepting new orders in the late afternoon, when the quality of light for fine work had diminished, but conversation and business still worked perfectly well. The craftsman's day was not merely a schedule, it was an accommodation, a working arrangement with the physical world, with light and temperature and the limits of the human body that had been refined over generations until it worked as well as it possibly could without electric light, without power tools, without any of the technologies we take entirely for granted. And within that accommodation, something was made every day, something that had not existed the night before, something made by hands, shaped by fire and water and wood and stone, and sent out into the world to be used. That as much as anything is what I want you to carry from this part of the story. The first hours were not just preparation, they were a commitment. A craftsman who lit his forge correctly set his tools in order and began his work with the first reliable light of morning. That person had already made a decision about the kind of worker they were going to be that day. It sounds small, it wasn't. We have walked through the morning now. But the workshop didn't just produce things, it guarded them too. Because beneath all the routine, beneath the fire and the hammer and the steady rhythm of the bellows, there was something else running through every medieval craft workshop. Something invisible, fiercely protected, and almost never spoken of to outsiders. The secrets. What the guild kept hidden, and what it would do to keep it that way, is one of the most extraordinary chapters in this entire story. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Secrets. Every society has them. Every family has them. But few institutions in human history have protected their secrets with the combination of elegance, ruthlessness, and sheer institutional commitment that the medieval guild brought to the task. And I do not use the word ruthlessness lightly here, because before this part of the story's over, we're going to arrive at a place where the consequence of sharing a professional secret was not a fine, not a public reprimand, not a strongly worded letter from the guild warden. It was an assassin. But let us get there properly, because the secrets themselves are just as extraordinary as the lengths taken to protect them. And to understand why any of this happened, we first need to understand what exactly was at stake. Knowledge in the medieval world was not the democratized, freely available thing it is in the modern age. There was no printing press before the middle of the 15th century. There were no published textbooks for craft trades, no technical manuals that anyone could buy and read. The knowledge that made a craftsman's work worth anything existed in exactly one place, inside the bodies and minds of the people who'd spent years acquiring it. This is not just a poetic observation. It is an economic one. If you were a master dyer in 14th century Bruges, and you had spent 15 years refining the exact sequence of mordants and temperatures that produced a particular shade of deep crimson that your competitors could not replicate, that knowledge was your business, your livelihood, your family's security, your position in the social order. And the moment someone else learned that sequence, your advantage evaporated. The guild system, for all its complicated politics and its many genuine flaws, understood this at a foundational level, which is why embedded in the regulations of nearly every craft guild in medieval Europe, there was always a version of the same rule: what happens in this workshop stays in this workshop. Let's start with colour, because the dyers of medieval Europe were keeping secrets more complex than most people have ever appreciated. To dye cloth in the Middle Ages was not simply a matter of dropping fabric into a vat of pigment and waiting. It was chemistry conducted entirely without the language of chemistry. It was intuition built from centuries of accumulated trial error and carefully protected wisdom. The three great dyestuffs of medieval Europe were woad madder and weld. Woad, a plant whose leaves produced the deep blue that dominated the clothing of northern Europe, required a fermentation process so peculiar, fermenting the crushed leaves in liquid, that included among other things human urine that the smell alone could identify a dyer's workshop from several streets away. Medieval towns regularly received complaints about this. Medieval towns regularly ignored the complaints, because the dyers were too economically important to antagonize. Madder root gave reds, weld gave yellows. Greens were achieved not through any single green dye, but by a careful sequence dyeing first with weld to create yellow, then immersing the cloth in a woad vat to add blue over it, hoping the combination would produce the right shade. Each step required knowing the exact temperature of the bath, the correct amount of mordant, the chemical fixative that made colours permanent, and the precise duration of immersion. And here is what the guilds understood that everyone else missed: the mordant was everything. Alum was the standard mordant for most colours, but the exact preparation, concentration and application of alum was a closely guarded secret of the dyers' guilds across Europe. Get it wrong, and the colour faded. Get it right, and the cloth held its colour through years of washing. A guildmaster's recipe book for mordants was among the most valuable documents he owned. More valuable, arguably, than his tools, because the tools could be replaced. The knowledge in that book could not, and those books were not shared. They were inherited within families, passed from master to chosen son or daughter, kept under lock, sometimes memorized, and never written down at all, precisely to prevent them from being stolen. Now I want to tell you about a city that took this logic to what I can only describe as its absolute extreme. Venice, in the 13th century, had built an empire on trade, and among the many things Venice traded, glass was in a category of its own. Venetian glass bottles, mirrors, decorative objects, lenses was known throughout Europe and the Middle East as the finest available. Wealthy customers from France to Egypt were paying extraordinary sums for it. The Venetian glassmakers had developed techniques that no one else had, and those techniques were the foundation of an industry that contributed enormously to the city's wealth. The Glassmakers' Guild of Venice recognized this, and in the year 1271 they passed their first law protecting it. Foreign workers were categorically banned from participating in the glass industry. Only Venetian citizens could know how it was made. That alone tells you how seriously they took the matter. But it was only the beginning. 20 years later, in 1291, the Venetian government issued a more drastic decree. All glass furnaces were to be moved from Venice itself to the nearby island of Murano, a cluster of small islands connected by short bridges and located just over a kilometre from the city. The official reason given was fire safety. Glass-making furnaces posed a hazard to Venice's densely packed wooden buildings. Most historians today believe that was a convenient excuse. The real reason was isolation. By concentrating all the glassmakers on a single island surrounded by water, the Venetian government created a controlled environment from which secrets could not easily escape. 4 years after that, in 1295, the government made it explicit Venetian glassblowers were forbidden from travelling abroad entirely. The island was in effect a gilded cage. Now here is the part that always gets me. Because the story of Murano is not simply a story about institutional greed and control, as compelling as that narrative is. It is also a story about the extraordinary privileges that were offered in exchange for the captivity. Murano glassmakers were given rights that no other craftsmen in Venice possessed. They were permitted to carry swords, a privilege normally reserved for nobility and military men. Their daughters were allowed to marry into Venetian noble families. They were shielded from certain prosecutions. They were given elevated social status, allowed to mingle in circles that most craftsmen could never enter. They were, in other words, treated like valuable assets, because that is precisely what they were. But let no one imagine this made the arrangement comfortable for everyone. Because what happened if a glassmaker decided that the privileges were not worth the confinement? What if he was offered debt forgiveness by Rome, or immunity from prosecution by a rival city, or, as apparently happened at least once, the forgiveness of sins from the Pope himself, in exchange for relocating and sharing what he knew? The guild's response evolved over time, and it got progressively less forgiving. First, the fugitive would be ordered to return. If he did not return, his family remaining in Venice would be imprisoned. If he still did not return, if whatever he had been offered was genuinely more attractive than watching his relatives suffer consequences on his behalf, then the Venetian state would send someone to find him. Not a diplomat, not a legal representative, someone else. The historical record confirms this was not merely a threat. It was a policy. Venetian glassmakers who fled and refused to return were hunted. The secrets of Murano glass production were under Venetian law, as it stood literally worth a human life to protect. Let that sit for a moment. We're talking about glass blowing, about decorative objects and mirrors, and yet the stakes were high enough, the economic and political significance of that knowledge was profound enough that a government was prepared to use extreme measures to contain it. Does that tell us something about the value of craft knowledge in the medieval world? Absolutely. But I think it tells us something else too. Something about what happens when a skill becomes so economically central to a society's identity that the society starts treating it not as an individual possession, but as collective property. As something that belongs to the state, the city, the guild, something that no individual has the right to take away because too many other people depend on it. That is an uncomfortable idea in a world that values individual freedom, but it is worth sitting with because versions of it are still with us today. Trade secrets law, intellectual property protection, non-disclosure agreements that people sign as a condition of employment. The medieval guild's logic was brutal in its methods, but its underlying premise that the knowledge inside a craftsman's head is not purely his own to do with as he pleases is one we have never actually abandoned. The glass story is extreme, but the principle of protected knowledge ran through every craft guild in medieval Europe, usually with less drama and rather more practicality. The swordsmiths of Toledo in Spain developed techniques for working steel that were considered the finest in the known world. Knights across Europe and eventually samurai from Japan sought out Toledo blades specifically. The secret of a Toledo sword lay in several things: the quality of the iron deposits in the region, the specific mineral composition of the Tagus River, whose water was used for tempering, and a forging technique so precise that it was known to the craftsmen not in written form but in rhythm. The blacksmiths of Toledo would heat their blades and recite psalms during the process not out of piety, though piety was certainly present but as a timing mechanism. The exact duration of heat, the exact moment of quenching, was counted out in the rhythm of prayer. A psalm recited at a consistent pace became a clock. A liturgical calendar became a technical specification. The blade, when finished correctly, had what the craftsman called a soul of iron, a wrought iron core encased in hard steel, giving it flexibility without brittleness. It could, legend says, be bent into a half circle and spring back without a crack. This was the mark of quality, the proof that the technique had been executed correctly, and it was achieved through a process that Toledo swordsmiths passed from father to son, from master to apprentice. For generations, never written down in complete form, always transmitted in person, always accompanied by the understanding that the transmission ended at the edge of the family's workshop. The Dyers had their recipe books, the glassblowers had their island, the swordsmiths had their prayers. Each of these represents a different solution to the same essential problem. How do you keep knowledge alive and transmit it reliably, while simultaneously preventing it from reaching people who have not earned it and are not entitled to it? The medieval answer, because it could not rely on legal systems sophisticated enough to protect intellectual property in the modern sense, was almost always personal. You kept the knowledge close. You shared it only with people whose loyalty was guaranteed by blood, by contract, by years of mutual dependence. You embedded it in practices that required physical presence to learn, not because you could not have written it down, but because writing it down made it portable, and portable meant stealable. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating about this. Some of the most guarded craft secrets in medieval Europe were not hidden because the masters were greedy or paranoid, though some were certainly both. They were hidden because the knowledge was genuinely difficult to transmit in any other way. The temperature of a dye bath assessed by putting your hand near the surface and feeling the heat on your skin. The moment iron is ready to work, judged by the colour of the glow inside a forge. The tension of a warp thread, correct or too tight, known through fingers that have adjusted 10,000 threads before. This knowledge resisted documentation not just because the guild wanted it to, but because human language had not yet developed sufficient precision to capture it. You cannot write, "Heat the bath until it feels ready." You cannot publish a recipe that says, "Add mordant until the colour is right." These instructions only make sense once your hands already know what they mean, and that gap between the knowledge a master carried in his body and the knowledge that language could adequately express was the guild's most reliable protection. Deeper than any law, more enduring than any locked recipe book. The secret that protected itself simply by being the kind of knowledge you had to be present to receive. What happened when those secrets were broken, though? When an apprentice watched too carefully, or when a journeyman carried something he should not have across a border. The consequences range from the economic to the severe, depending on the guild and the century and the particular secret in question. Dyers' guilds in medieval Flanders would strip a master of his guild membership if he was found to have shared proprietary techniques with an outsider. That might not sound catastrophic, but understand what guild membership meant. It was the right to practice your craft legally, to sell your goods at market, to train apprentices to have your quality certified. Without it, you were not a craftsman. You were a person with some skills and no legal standing. You could not work. Your family went hungry. The guild had effectively erased you from the professional world. In other places, the punishment was more physical. Guild records from various cities describe craftsmen who were fined, publicly shamed, or driven out of town for disclosing protected techniques. There are accounts of workshops ransacked by guild inspectors on suspicion of harbouring stolen knowledge, a master from a rival city working illegally teaching techniques he'd acquired somewhere he should not have. And then there is Venice, where we've already established that the logic reached its furthest point. One final story before we move on, because I think it captures something essential about the relationship between knowledge loyalty and the human impulse to be recognised for what you know. In the early 15th century, around 1415, a Venetian glassmaker named Giorgio left Murano. He managed to reach the court of a powerful German prince, bringing with him the ability to produce certain kinds of Venetian glass that no one outside the island knew how to make. He was welcomed, celebrated, given resources and status. Venice was not amused. They sent representatives to demand his return. When that failed, the situation escalated in the predictable direction. What became of Giorgio specifically, history is uncertain about. But his story was well known enough among the glassmakers of Murano that it became a kind of cautionary tale told informally, probably with some embellishment to every new generation of craftsmen who grew up on the island. A reminder of what the limits were, a reminder of where the boundary between a craftsman's personal knowledge and the state's collective property was drawn. In the medieval craft world, that boundary was not negotiable, and the people who tried to negotiate it generally found out why. We began this story in a workshop at dawn, watching a man tend his forge. We've watched young apprentices sign away their adolescence in exchange for a craft. We have followed the first hours of a working day governed entirely by sunlight. And now we have seen how deeply, how fiercely the knowledge that underpinned all of it was protected. But here is the thing about secrets: they are only valuable as long as the people who hold them are actually working. And what exactly did the midday world of a medieval craftsman look like? What did they eat? What did they worry about? And how much of a workday's economy actually made it into their pockets? That is what we are heading into next, and I promise you the numbers are more surprising than you might expect. Midday. The church bell has rung, and across the town of Troy the rhythm of the working morning pauses. Dogs lift their heads. Market vendors stretch their backs. Children who have been running small errands since before sunrise finally slow down. In William's workshop, the hammer stops. And this is the moment most people, when they imagine a medieval craftsman's day, picture as a simple pause, a brief rest before the afternoon begins. A man wiping soot from his hands, eating something modest, perhaps napping in the weak autumn sunlight before returning to work. What actually happened in that midday hour and the hours that framed it is considerably more interesting than that picture suggests. It was not rest. It was in many ways the most consequential part of the workday. The part where the economics of the whole enterprise either held together or started to unravel. Let us start with the food, because even that was more loaded than it appears. The midday meal was the main meal of the day for working people in medieval Europe. Not dinner in the evening, that was a later invention, something that came with artificial lighting and the ability to do useful things after dark. In a world regulated by natural light, the large meal happened when the sun was high and the afternoon's work was still ahead. You needed the fuel. There was no point saving it for when you were winding down. For a craftsman of Williams standing a guildmaster with his own workshop, a man of some small but real substance in his community, the midday table would have included bread ale and a pottage. Pottage was the universal food of medieval working life, a thick stew built from whatever was available, its base usually oats or barley or dried peas, supplemented with leeks and turnips and whatever garden vegetables the season offered. Meat appeared when it could be afforded, which was not every day, salt pork occasionally, scraps of mutton on better weeks. This sounds humble, and by our standards it absolutely is, but here is where it gets interesting. The Cuxham Manor accounts from the 1320s, one of the more detailed surviving records of what working people actually ate, describe the daily provisions for farm labourers in some detail. Those labourers were eating bread and pottage with ale, and the quantities were not starvation rations. The calories were sufficient for heavy physical labour. The variety was genuinely limited, but the volume was not negligible. Now a skilled craftsman, a guild-registered blacksmith or carpenter, was earning considerably more than an agricultural labourer. According to records compiled from medieval wage surveys, a hired craftsman in early 14th century England could expect somewhere between 3 and 9 pennies a day, depending on skill and location, while an agricultural labourer was typically at the lower end of that range or below it. A master carpenter in London by the early 15th century was earning around 8 pennies per day, 60 to 100% more than craftsmen in smaller rural settings. A single penny could buy roughly a quarter loaf of bread or a pint of ale or a handful of eggs, which sounds like a reasonable income until you start running the numbers on what William actually had to spend that money on. Here is where I want to slow down, because the economics of running a medieval craft workshop are genuinely surprising, and not in a flattering way. The money coming into the workshop was one thing. The money going out was another thing entirely, and the gap between them was often much smaller than historians used to assume. Raw materials were the first and largest drain. A blacksmith needed charcoal, a weaver needed wool or linen thread. A carpenter needed timber which had to be sourced, transported and stored. A tanner needed hides oak bark and enormous quantities of water. These were not incidental costs. They were the foundation of everything, and their prices fluctuated with harvests, with trade disruptions, with the availability of the particular suppliers you depended on. A harsh winter that reduced charcoal production could squeeze a blacksmith's margins for months. Then there was the guild fee. Membership in a guild was not free. There were annual dues entry fees when you first joined, periodic assessments for collective projects, the maintenance of the guild hall, the payment of the guild's chaplain, the organisation of the feast day procession that the whole guild was expected to participate in, which was itself a cost because you were not working during the procession. Guild membership was worth it. Unambiguously, it gave you the legal right to practice your trade, the quality certification that customers trusted, and a form of professional insurance if things went wrong. But it was never free. Then rent if you did not own your workshop outright. Most craftsmen in 13th and 14th century towns rented their space. Workshop rent was not negligible. Housing costs for a skilled tradesman renting a modest craftsman's dwelling could represent a meaningful fraction of annual income. Depending on the town and the decade, that fraction swung considerably. Then the cost of feeding and housing the apprentice who worked for free in the sense of receiving no wages but ate at your table and slept under your roof and wore clothing you were responsible for providing. Add it up. William's situation, stripped of any romance, looks like this. He was a man running a small business with high fixed costs, unpredictable raw material expenses, regulatory fees. He could not avoid dependents he had taken on voluntarily, and customers who, as we have already established, did not always pay in cash. And that last part is crucial. Cash was not the default in medieval commerce. It sounds strange to say, but a significant portion of everyday transactions in a medieval town, including transactions between skilled craftsmen and their regular customers, were conducted on credit. Encyclopedia sources on medieval urban life are explicit about this. Cash was a rare commodity in medieval Europe, and much trade even in cities depended on networks of informal credit and barter. Coins existed and were used, but many of the coins in circulation were worth more than most small transactions required. A single ounce of silver was generally equivalent to a week's wages for a skilled worker, which made it poorly suited for settling a small account for a set of door hinges or a repaired ploughshare. What this meant in practice was a web of informal obligation. William made things for customers. The customers either paid immediately in whatever combination of coins and goods could be arranged, or they ran a tab. William ran tabs with his suppliers in the same way. Everyone owed everyone something, and the actual settlement of debts happened periodically at market days at the end of a season, sometimes at the end of a year in a messy negotiated, very human process that looked nothing like a modern invoice and bank transfer. The carpenter, who still had not paid for his hinges, he was part of this system. He was not necessarily dishonest. He was probably himself waiting on payment from someone else. Medieval credit networks were not straight lines. They were tangled loops, and the craftsmen at the centre of them had to track what they were owed by whom since when, and what they could realistically expect to collect all in their heads or in simple written records if they were literate enough to keep them, which many were not. This was the hidden administrative work of a medieval craftsman, not the glamorous part, not the part that makes it into paintings, the part where you stood in your workshop after the midday meal and tried to calculate whether you had enough incoming to cover the payment due to your charcoal supplier next Tuesday. You know what, I want to ask you something, and I am asking this genuinely, not rhetorically. If you had to run a business the way William ran his, no accounting software, no bank account, no reliable way to verify what customers owed, no legal mechanism strong enough to compel payment without expensive and slow court processes, how long do you think you would last before something slipped through? Before you miscalculated a debt or trusted the wrong customer or had a bad month of materials and a worse month of collections? Most of us, I suspect, would not last very long, and yet men and women like William did this routinely for their entire working lives, generation after generation. The skill of keeping the mental ledger of knowing the state of the workshop's finances without a single digital tool was as real and as hard-won as the skill of working the metal. The midday break also served a function that was more social than economic, and that dimension gets lost when we focus only on the ledger. The hour around the noon meal was when information moved. A customer who came to collect finished goods would linger to talk. A journeyman from another workshop might stop in with news from the market. A neighbour who happened to pass would share what she'd heard at the breed sellers that morning. Medieval towns were small. The information network was human entirely, and it operated on exactly this kind of casual contact. What was the price of wool at last week's market? Had the merchant from Lyon arrived yet with his shipment of dyes? Was it true that the miller on the North Road had been fined again for short waiting? Had anyone heard about the new guild regulation that was apparently being discussed at the next meeting? This was not gossip. Well, it was gossip, but it was also market intelligence. It was competitive intelligence. Knowing that a raw material price was about to rise, or that a rival craftsman had lost a major commission, or that a particular customer was having financial difficulties and probably should not be extended further credit, these pieces of information could make meaningful differences to how William managed the next few weeks. And most of it moved through exactly these informal midday conversations over bread and pottage, and a mug of ale that was more about calories than celebration. There is one more dimension of midday that I want to spend a moment on because it reveals something about how differently the medieval world thought about time. Medieval guild regulations across Europe, and we touched on this when we discussed the prohibition on working after dark, were explicit about rest breaks. The working day was long, yes, particularly in summer, but it was not continuous. Records from craft guilds and manor accounts consistently describe a midday rest that lasted between 1 and 2 hours. Not just time for the meal, but time for genuine rest afterward. Some historical sources refer to the mid-morning and mid-afternoon pauses as traditional rights of labourers, customary breaks that were considered part of the implicit contract of the working day, and which employers were not supposed to deny. The medieval craftsman's relationship with rest was in some ways more protected than that of a modern salaried worker who eats lunch at their desk and checks emails while pretending not to. This is the paradox that keeps surfacing when you look closely at medieval working life. Objectively harsh in so many ways, the physical danger, the limited income, the absence of safety nets, the food that was adequate but monotonous, the constant proximity to poverty. And yet built into the structure of the day and the year were protections and rhythms that modern working life has largely abandoned. The afternoon nap that some historical accounts mention is real. It was not an affectation or a luxury. It was the body's response to a large meal eaten in the middle of physical labour, and it was broadly accepted as a normal part of the day's rhythm. Whether William actually took one depended on how much work was waiting and what mood he was in. But nobody thought it strange if he did. By the time the afternoon properly began, the light still adequate, the food settling the morning's heaviest work behind him. William's workshop had a different quality to it. The frantic efficiency of the early hours was gone, replaced by something steadier. The apprentice was practicing on scraps of iron, repeating small gestures under supervision. The journeyman was working on a commission that required less brute force and more patience. William himself was doing the things that required experience rather than energy, checking the quality of completed pieces, adjusting work that was not quite right, making the judgments that only years of accumulated knowledge could make, and thinking, always thinking, about what the morning had cost him in materials, about what the next week would require, about the order from the church steward that was more complicated than he had initially quoted for, about the apprentice who was truthfully not progressing as quickly as expected and what to do about that. The afternoon was when the quiet weight of running a business settled back onto his shoulders after the morning's physical work had briefly lifted it. It was not easier than the morning, just different. And somewhere in that afternoon, a choice was being made that neither William nor anyone around him was framing as a choice, but that shaped the entire economics of medieval craft work in ways that historians have spent decades trying to fully understand. The Guild's founding philosophy emphasized guaranteeing a minimum livelihood, rather than maximizing profit meant that William was not in any straightforward sense trying to grow. He was not trying to scale. He was not building towards something larger. He was trying to sustain to keep the workshop viable. The apprentice fed, the family housed, the guild fee paid, and the craft practiced at a level that preserved his reputation and his standing. That is a different kind of ambition than the modern world recognizes. Not better or worse, just different. And in that difference lies something worth sitting with for a moment, something about what we want work to be for, and whether the answers have actually changed as much as we like to think. The afternoon light is beginning to angle. The workshop will not close yet, but the day is moving toward its closing hours. And somewhere in that shift, somewhere in the transition from the steady productivity of mid-afternoon to the quiet assessment of evening, something happened in medieval workshops that most history books either miss entirely or mention only in passing. The women, the wives, the daughters, the widows, the women who built, ran, and sometimes saved these workshops while history was busy writing about the men who owned them. Their story is the one we're heading into next, and it is, in my honest opinion, one of the most underestimated stories in this entire account of medieval working life. Picture a road in late autumn. Somewhere in the Rhine Valley the year is around 1300. The trees are half stripped. The ground has that particular dampness that makes every footstep sound heavier than it is. And walking along this road alone, carrying everything he owns in a cloth bundle tied to a stick across his shoulder, is a young man of 19. His name is Thomas. He is not a pilgrim. He is not a soldier. He's not running from anything, or at least he was not supposed to be. He is a craftsman, a joiner trained for 7 years under a master in Cologne, and now equipped with the document called a Lehrbrief that records his name, his father's name, the name of his master, and the number of years he served. It is the only proof he carries of who he is and what he can do. He is not allowed to go home. He will not be allowed to go home for at least 3 years and 1 day. And even when that time is up, he cannot return until he has earned something worth returning with. This is the Wanderjahre, the wandering years, and it is without question one of the most extraordinary institutions that medieval craft culture ever produced. We need to understand why this existed before we can appreciate what it meant to live through it. The journeyman system, the stage between completing an apprenticeship and achieving the status of master, was on its surface a practical arrangement. An apprentice who had finished 7 years of training knew one workshop, one master's methods, one city's materials, one local tradition. And that was a problem because craft knowledge in the medieval world was not standardized across regions. A carpenter who had trained only in Cologne had learned to work with the timber available in Cologne, in the style practiced in Cologne using the joinery techniques that had evolved in Cologne over generations. That was fine for working in Cologne. It was genuinely limiting for understanding the full range of what the craft could be. The wandering years solved this by forcing young craftsmen out of the nest, by making the discomfort of departure not a choice but a requirement, by saying in essence you think you know this craft. Go find out what you do not know. The minimum period was 3 years, and one day a specific duration that appears in guild records across the German land, Switzerland and France, with a consistency that makes it feel almost mythological. 3 years and 1 day, long enough to matter, precise enough to be enforced. During that time, the journeyman was forbidden from returning to within 50 kilometers of his hometown. That distance was not arbitrary. It was calculated to prevent the kind of short, comfortable retreat that would defeat the purpose of the whole exercise. You could not simply disappear for a year, work in the nearest town and come home claiming you had wandered. You had to actually go. What a journeyman carried on that road tells you a great deal about the world he was moving through. The Lehrbrief was essential, the single document that established his legitimacy. Without it, he was just a young man with calloused hands claiming to know a trade. With it, he could present himself at the workshop of any guild master in any city along his route, and the master was obligated, within the norms of the system, to evaluate his skills and potentially offer him work. The journeyman also carried a small amount of money, but here is a rule that I find either admirable or slightly insane depending on my mood. When I think about it, he was supposed to return home with the same amount of money he left with, no more. The point of the wandering years was not to accumulate wealth, it was to accumulate experience. Spending money on comfortable lodging rather than earning it through work, or building up savings rather than investing time in learning, were both considered failures of purpose. He also, in many traditions, carried a golden earring, not as a fashion statement, as a practical contingency. Gold was universally recognizable and relatively universally convertible. If the journeyman died far from home, a far from negligible possibility, given the hazards of medieval roads, medieval winters, and medieval medicine, the earring could be sold to cover the cost of burial. The golden earring was a journeyman's insurance policy, worn on his body precisely because it was the thing least likely to be lost or stolen. That detail always stays with me. The idea that you walked out your door young and newly trained and full of whatever combination of excitement and terror that departure tends to produce, and you wore your funeral fund in your ear because you were going into uncertainty and you knew it. The road itself was genuinely dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully convey to a modern audience accustomed to paved highways and emergency services. Records from 14th century France compiled by the historian Marjorie Nice-Boyer suggest that travellers on foot could cover roughly 30 miles per day, which sounds manageable until you consider that it meant 8 to 10 hours of continuous walking, without hiking boots, without reliable maps, on roads that were depending on the season and the recent weather, either rutted tracks through mud or frozen ruts through frozen mud, neither of which was especially kind to feet. Brigandage was real. Highwaymen operated on routes that everyone knew were dangerous, and the journeyman's small amount of money visible in the form of coins made him a plausible target. He was not allowed to carry weapons, at least not openly, because an unarmed traveller could claim a kind of neutral protected status in many regional codes. An armed traveller was a combatant. An unarmed one was theoretically someone you did not trouble. Theoretically. Lodging depended entirely on hospitality networks that the journeyman had to navigate as he went. Monasteries along the route provided shelter to travellers, including craftsmen. Inns existed but cost money that most journeymen were trying not to spend. Barns were frequently the answer on nights when nothing better was available. And in some of the French cities along what would eventually become formalised as the Tour de France, the great circuit of towns through which French journeymen travelled there, were established guest houses run by women known as mères, literally mothers, who housed travelling craftsmen from their particular trade, fed them if they arrived without money, and introduced them to local masters who might have work available. The word compagnon comes as the French brotherhood that still exists today explains it from two Latin words, cum meaning with, and panis meaning bread. A companion is someone with whom you share bread. The journeyman's fraternity was built on exactly that. The shared meal, the shared uncertainty, the shared road. But here is what made the wandering years genuinely irreplaceable as a system, and what I think gets lost when we reduce it to a simple description of travel. Every time a journeyman arrived in a new city and found work in a new workshop, he was exposed to a slightly different version of his own craft, a slightly different sequence for a familiar operation, a different local timber species with its own grain and resistance, a different finishing technique, a different master with decades of personal innovation accumulated in his hands. And because the journeyman was skilled enough to actually practice the craft, not an apprentice sweeping floors, but a qualified craftsman doing real work, he could absorb these differences at a technical level. He could feel the difference between one master's approach and another's. He could notice where one city's methods produced a stronger joint and wonder why. He could carry a technique from a workshop in Strasbourg to a master in Vienna who had never encountered it. The wandering journeyman was in this sense the medieval world's primary mechanism for the lateral transmission of craft knowledge across geography. Without printing presses, without technical journals, without universities for practical trades, the knowledge moved in human beings. It walked from city to city, carried in the bodies and memories of young craftsmen who were simultaneously learning and transmitting, absorbing from one workshop and depositing into the next. The artistic historian's observation about the Vendéar period being critical to the transmission of artistic style across Europe is not an overstatement. The particular way stone was carved in one region, the furniture forms that appeared in one city, and then migrated over a generation to appear in cities 500 miles away, much of that movement happened because journeymen carried it there. Not as deliberate cultural ambassadors, simply as people doing their jobs in new places. I want to tell you about something that exists in France today because I think it is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the world, and almost nobody outside France knows about it. The Compagnons du Devoir, the Companions of Duty, are a living brotherhood of craftsmen that traces its origins directly back to the medieval journeyman traditions we've been discussing. They still practice the Tour de France. Young craftsmen accepted into the brotherhood after completing a formal apprenticeship set out on a circuit of city across France and eventually other countries, spending typically 6 months to a year in each location, living in a maison de compagnon, working in local workshops under the guidance of more senior members. They're not allowed to stay more than 3 months in the same place. They carry a walking stick, traditional clothing specific to their trade, and a document recording their journey. When they arrive in a new city, a designated member of the local chapter meets them and introduces them to potential employers. The organisation was formally established in 1941, but its roots are medieval, and it has maintained a continuity of practice and philosophy that makes it one of the most extraordinary surviving connections to how craft knowledge was transmitted before the industrial world reorganised everything. In 2019, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, inscribed the French compagnonnage on its list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity, specifically recognising the transmission of craft knowledge through the travelling brotherhood as something worth protecting at a global level. They described it as a living embodiment of the transmission of know-how, with roots stretching back to medieval craft culture. 800 years ago, a young joiner named Thomas was walking through the Rhine Valley in the cold, trying to find a workshop that would take him in for the winter. In France today, his direct spiritual descendants are doing something remarkably similar and the world has only just decided it is worth preserving. Let me ask you something. Have you ever left a situation that was comfortable and known and forced yourself into somewhere unfamiliar specifically because you understood that the discomfort was the point, that the thing you were looking for could not be found in the place you already were? If you have, you know something of what the Wandering Years were about. The medieval guild formalized and institutionalized an insight that is genuinely ancient, that mastery requires exposure to things you do not yet know, and the only way to find those things is to go looking for them in places where your existing knowledge does not quite fit. It sounds obvious. Most true things do once someone has said them, but there is a difference between knowing that as an idea and being 19 years old on a November road, 50 kilometers from home with 3 years ahead of you, and no guarantee of what they will contain. Thomas, in our story, did survive the road. He ended up spending the first winter in Basel working under a master cabinet maker whose approach to dovetail joints was unlike anything he had learned in Cologne. He spent a summer in Regensburg where the timber was different and the clients were richer and the work more demanding. He eventually crossed the Alps, which in the winter months was exactly as alarming as it sounds, and spent half a year working in a Florentine workshop where joinery techniques developed under the influence of Italian Renaissance workshops were unlike anything the Germanic tradition had produced. He returned home after 4 years rather than 3 because he ran out of road before he ran out of things to learn. When he came back, he was not the same person who had left. He had not merely added techniques to his existing knowledge, he had expanded the framework of what he understood the craft to be capable of. That is what the Wandering Years were designed to produce. Not a better version of what you already were. Something genuinely new. The question that nags at me, though the one I cannot fully shake, is about the journeymen who did not come back. Not the ones who died on the road, though that happened often enough. I mean the ones who arrived somewhere, found work, found a community, found a reason to stay. Who decided at some point along the route that the home they were supposed to return to was less interesting than the place where they currently were. Medieval towns across Europe absorbed wandering craftsmen this way. A city like Florence or Bruges or Cologne was in part built by people who had arrived as journeymen from somewhere else and never quite left. Their techniques became part of the local tradition. Their children were apprenticed to local masters. Their knowledge became after a generation indistinguishable from the local knowledge. The wandering was supposed to be temporary, but the knowledge it carried stayed wherever it landed. Thomas eventually became a master. He opened a small workshop in Cologne, not much larger than the one he had learned in as a child, but recognizably his own. His methods were not purely what his original master had taught him. They were a combination of Cologne tradition, Basel precision, the patience he had absorbed from Florentine work and the specific lessons of 4 years of road. And when he took on his first apprentice, a boy of 12 from the Tanner's Street, the son of a man who owed him a small debt, Thomas would have known from his own experience exactly what the next 7 years were going to cost that child. He knew, and he took the boy on anyway. That choice to perpetuate the system, to pay forward the demanding education that had shaped him, is in its quiet way as much a part of this story as everything else we've discussed. Because the cycle did not end with one master. It never did. It continued year after year, workshop by workshop, apprentice by apprentice, across the whole fractured, complicated, extraordinary medieval world. And at the centre of that cycle, waiting for every journeyman who eventually completed his road and came home, was the thing that determined whether all of it had been worth anything at all. The masterpiece. One object, one chance, everything on the table. That is where we go next. There is a word we use so casually now that we've almost entirely forgotten it ever meant anything specific. Masterpiece. We call a film a masterpiece, a novel, a painting, a meal that came out unexpectedly well on a Tuesday evening. The word has expanded over the centuries to cover almost any work of exceptional quality, which is generous in its own way, but also represents a kind of linguistic forgetting. Because the original meaning of masterpiece was not a description of something beautiful. It was the name of a test, a single high-stakes, no-second chances examination that determined whether a craftsman who had spent years, perhaps the entirety of his 20s, working and travelling and learning and waiting, would finally be allowed to open his own workshop, to have his own name above the door, to be at last his own man. And the word itself, the phrase chef d'oeuvre in French from which our English version descended, is a term of medieval origin rooted not in philosophy or aesthetics, but in the language of guild regulation. It appears first in the regulatory documents of craft associations embedded in the legal language that governed how professional standing was earned and lost, not in art criticism, not in praise, in law. That fact alone tells you something important about what the masterpiece actually was. Let us set the scene correctly, because the drama of the masterpiece tends to get romanticised in ways that slightly miss the point. The journeyman who had returned from the wandering years 3, 4, sometimes 5 years on the road was not simply presenting a beautiful object to an appreciative audience. He was petitioning a guild for entry, which meant he was walking into a room full of established masters, all of whom had passed through this same gate, all of whom understood exactly what was required, and some of whom, let us be clear about this, had a quiet economic interest in the gate remaining difficult. New masters were competition. Every journeyman who successfully completed a masterpiece and entered the guild as a full member would soon open a workshop, take on apprentices, and begin competing for the same pool of customers. The guild's official position was that it welcomed capable new members who maintained quality. The unofficial reality was more complicated. Guilds controlled how many masters could work in a given area, and the standards for the masterpiece had a curious historical tendency to become more demanding over time, not necessarily because craft knowledge was advancing, but because the incumbents found the scrutiny useful. In Paris, local-born locksmiths were initially exempted from the masterpiece requirement entirely. Only outsiders had to prove themselves. It was only toward the end of the 15th century that even local candidates were required to complete what was called a demi-chef d'oeuvre, a half-masterpiece, a somewhat easier version of the full test. The sons of existing masters in many guilds paid reduced fees, had easier access to examination slots, and sometimes bypassed the masterpiece requirement altogether. None of this is surprising in the way that nothing human is ever surprising once you understand that the people involved have mortgages and competitors and children to feed. But it is worth naming clearly, the masterpiece was simultaneously a genuine test of craft skill and a mechanism for controlling access to a profession. Both things were true at the same time, which is perhaps why the institution survived so long. What did a masterpiece actually look like? This is the question I always want to get to, because the variety of answers is genuinely astonishing. And I think it illustrates something essential about how the medieval mind conceived of skill itself. For a goldsmith in Nuremberg, and we have remarkably detailed records of this from guild statutes preserved between 1531 and 1572, an aspiring master was required to produce not one object but 3, a columbine cup, a die for a steel seal, and a gold ring set with a precious stone. 3 different challenges, each testing a different technical domain. The cup required mastery of form and construction. The seal die demanded precision engraving. The ring combined material knowledge with setting technique. You could not fake your way through one of them. You could not distract from a weakness in one area by excellence in another, because all 3 were examined separately. For a locksmith, and this is perhaps my favourite example, because it is so technically beautiful, the masterpiece was a functioning lock, not a decorative object that happened to look like a lock. an actual working mechanism capable of being locked and unlocked, its interior components correctly engineered, its exterior finished to a standard the guild considered acceptable. Surviving masterpiece locks from this period now in museums across Europe are extraordinary objects. Some of them required hidden mechanisms to find the keyhole at all secondary buttons or levers that had to be triggered before the main lock could be accessed. They look like small sculptures, but every decorative element was also functional. The beauty and the engineering were inseparable. For painters seeking entry to their guild regulations in Paris and elsewhere specified that most candidates should execute either a depiction of the Madonna and Child or a scene of the Crucifixion, not because the guild was particularly devout, but because these were technically demanding subjects with established compositional standards against which the work could be objectively compared. There was no ambiguity about what was required, and no escape into pure personal expression. For barbers in Reims in the 15th century, and here is where it gets unexpectedly specific, the masterpiece requirement was documented in extraordinary detail. The candidate had to demonstrate that he could wet and shave in a competent manner, comb and trim a beard, prepare lancets for bloodletting, and demonstrate sufficient anatomical knowledge to distinguish between a vein and an artery. Because barbers in that period also performed minor surgery, and the guild was not going to send incompetent cutters out into a world that needed its veins intact. The range is almost comic in its variety. Rope makers had their knots evaluated, apothecaries had their preparations tested, confectioners presented pastries, carpenters submitted joints. Every trade defined its masterpiece according to what the trade actually demanded, and the result was a testing regime that was across all its variations genuinely calibrated to function. The masterpiece in each trade demonstrated real competence, not the performance of competence. Now here is the detail that changes how you feel about the whole institution. When the masterpiece was accepted, when the guild masters examined the lock or the cup or the painting and judged it sufficient, the object was taken from the journeyman who had made it. The guild kept it, not as a trophy awarded to the winner, not as an acknowledgement of ownership, kept in the sense of possession. The masterpiece belonged to the guild, not to its maker. For a craftsman who had perhaps spent weeks or months on this single object, who had poured into it everything learned in 7 years of apprenticeship and 3 or 4 years on the road, who had put it on the table in front of the people, whose judgment would determine the entire shape of his professional life, to have it simply taken at the end of the examination is a strange kind of ending. Not cruel exactly. The rules were known in advance, but not uncomplicated either. I think there is something genuinely moving in the image of a locksmith who has just produced the finest lock of his career, a mechanism with hidden panels and a concealed keyhole, and small decorative flourishes worked into the iron that nobody required, but that he could not resist adding, watching it be carried away by the guild warden. It is yours, and then it is the institution's, and those are two very different things. What the journeyman received in return was the right to become someone else entirely, which is perhaps a reasonable trade. The masterpiece had to be completed alone. This rule, which appears consistently in guild regulations across trades and centuries, deserves some reflection, because as historians of medieval craftwork have noted, it ran entirely contrary to the normal working practice of the medieval workshop. In ordinary circumstances, the production of any complex object was collaborative. A statue might be roughed out by one hand, detailed by another, and finished by a third. A panel painting involved multiple specialists working on different elements. A large piece of furniture might be assembled from components made by several craftsmen working simultaneously. Cooperation was not just accepted in medieval workshop practice, it was the standard operating procedure. But for the masterpiece you worked alone. The guild regulations were explicit: no advice, no assistance, no collaborative process. The candidate was typically given a specific location, sometimes a room within the guild hall itself, and a specific period of time, and within those constraints he had to produce the required object entirely by his own hand. Why this rule in a culture that otherwise embraced craft collaboration? The answer, I think, is that the masterpiece was not primarily a demonstration of what the candidate could make. It was a demonstration of what he was. The collaborative workshop produced objects. The isolated candidate revealed the individual, and what the guild needed to know what it was actually testing was not whether this particular piece of iron was well made, but whether this particular human being had absorbed enough across all those years to sustain and uphold the standards of the guild operating independently. The masterpiece was in this sense less of an art exam and more of an X-ray, an image of the craftsman taken in conditions of absolute isolation, stripped of every advantage that collaboration and assistance normally provided. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where everything you have worked toward came down to a single performance? A job interview, a presentation, an audition, an exam, something where all the preparation either showed itself or it didn't, and there was no possibility of explanation or context or extenuating circumstances, because that is what the masterpiece was. And the thing I find most human about it is that the journeyman who approached this moment knew, going in, that some of them would fail. They would fail not necessarily because they lacked skill. They would fail because the guild controlled how many new masters it admitted, and in some periods and places the number of slots available was deliberately limited. A journeyman might produce a technically excellent masterpiece and still be turned down, not because the work was deficient, but because the existing masters had collectively decided that the market could not accommodate another competitor. When that happened, the journeyman could continue to work, but only for other masters as an employee. He could not open his own workshop, could not train his own apprentices, could not sit in the guild hall, could not vote on guild decisions that affected his working life. And in some guilds, apprentices were not permitted to marry until they had achieved full membership. So a rejected journeyman might find that the masterpiece's failure affected not just his professional standing, but the timeline of his entire personal life. The stakes were real, and the outcome was not guaranteed, and the people judging you had reasons beyond pure craft assessment for their decisions. There is one more dimension of the masterpiece that I want to spend a moment on because it explains why a 500-year-old word is still in our mouths today. The successful masterpiece did not just admit a craftsman to the guild, it changed his relationship to everything he subsequently made. Before the masterpiece, a craftsman made things for masters. After it, he made things as a master. That distinction sounds subtle until you understand what it meant practically. The master's name went on the work. The master's mark, a small distinctive symbol stamped or carved or woven into finished goods, identified the maker to anyone who held the object. Guild inspectors checking the market could look at a mark and know immediately who was responsible for the piece. If the quality was wrong, they knew who to find. This accountability was in a strange way a form of freedom. The master's name and his work were inseparable. His reputation was embedded literally in every object he produced, which meant that his work over decades accumulated into a kind of extended argument. This is who I am. This is what I can do. This is the standard I hold myself to spoken, not through words, but through the consistent quality of the objects he put into the world. The word we inherited from this system masterpiece travelled from the regulatory language of medieval guilds into the broader vocabulary of artistic excellence. By the early 17th century, it was already being used outside the guild context to describe any work of exceptional skill. The guild system that produced the word began to dissolve. The word remained, which means that every time we call something a masterpiece today, we are reaching back unknowingly to the moment a journeyman sat alone in a guild room, hands steady or unsteady, making the object that would decide everything. Thomas R. Joyner from the Rhine Valley completed his masterpiece in the spring of a year we can only approximate as somewhere in the early 1300s. He made a cabinet. Small, fitted with an interior compartment whose lock mechanism was not required by the guild but which he could not leave out. The dovetail joints when the guild master ran his thumb along them were smooth and precise, in a way that he had not achieved before the wandering years, a way that carried something from Basel he had never acquired in Cologne. The guild voted. The vote was not unanimous. It rarely was. But it was sufficient, and his name went above the door. The workshop now properly his was about to receive someone new. A woman of 34 whose circumstances had left her running a craft business she had not been trained in, not been prepared for, and was not technically supposed to be managing at all. Her story is next, and it is, if anything, more remarkable than Thomas's. Her name was Johanna. She had 4 apprentices, a household of 20 people, and a foundry in the parish of St. Botolph, in Aldgate, London. She made bells. Not decorative bells, not household objects, church bells. The kind that hang in towers and mark the hours and call communities to prayer, the kind whose casting requires precise metallurgical knowledge, serious capital investment, and a level of technical skill that took years to acquire. 7 of the bells Johanna Hill produced between 1440 and 1441 have survived into the modern world. They are still identified by her maker's mark, her husband Richard's mark, surmounted by a lozenge which was the conventional signal that the bell had been made by a woman. Johanna Hill died in May of 1441. She left the foundry to her daughter, also named Johanna, who later passed it to a woman named Johanna Sturdy, who ran the same facility independently, and produced 10 more bells that survive today. 3 women, 1 foundry, decades of continuous production. Church bells in Devon, Buckinghamshire, Essex, Hertfordshire, Suffolk and Sussex still hanging in towers, still ringing, made by hands that history spent several centuries declining to credit. That is where we begin. The standard story of medieval craftwork, the one we have been carefully building through this entire journey, is on its surface a story about men. Masters and apprentices, journeymen and guilds forge and loom and chisel. And that story is real. The men existed. The workshops existed. The guild system was overwhelmingly administered by men, and the formal records of medieval professional life reflect that fact with a consistency that can feel totalizing. But the formal records are not the whole truth. They are not even most of the truth. They are the part of the truth that was written down, which in a world where legal status, property rights, and public professional identity were largely reserved for men, naturally skews toward men. The women were there. They were always there. The historical challenge is not finding them. It is understanding why so many of them were systematically invisible to the documents that everyone later used to understand the past. This is not a minor grievance. It is a historiographical problem with real consequences for how we understand what medieval craft culture actually was. When we see a medieval illustration of a workshop, and it shows only men, we are looking at an idealized representation of professional life, not an accurate depiction of who was in the building. The woman grinding pigment in the corner, the wife checking the ledger, the widow managing the apprentices, they were there. The artist simply did not put them in the picture. Women entered craft workshops through 3 main routes, and understanding these routes explains a great deal about the variety of their experiences. The first was the family workshop. In medieval craft culture, as we have seen throughout this story, the line between home and workplace was essentially non-existent. The workshop was attached to the house. Meals were eaten in the same space where orders were discussed. Children grew up underfoot in the shop, and wives who managed households that were also commercial operations were not passive observers of the work. They kept accounts. They managed supply relationships. They dealt with customers when their husbands were occupied. They understood the trade sometimes as thoroughly as the nominal master, because they had been immersed in it daily for years. Tax records from Paris in the early 14th century list craftswomen whose listed occupation was different from their husband's meaning. They were recognized as practicing separate trades independently, not merely assisting with their husband's work. Records from early 15th century Würzburg show over 300 women working at building sites. The variety of documented women's occupations in medieval records is genuinely astonishing. Barrel maker, book binder, candle maker, glazier, or miner, silver miner, book illuminator, scribe, court assessor, customs officer, soap boiler, doll painter, rope maker. Not soft trades, not domestic extensions, trades. The second route was apprenticeship. Women were formally apprenticed in medieval England, most often in the silk and textile trades, though records exist of female apprentices in food production, leatherwork, and even metalwork. In 1446, William de Ennefeld, a craftsman who worked with wood for saddles, bequeathed the remaining term of his apprentice's service to his wife Agnes, effectively passing on his professional responsibility. Agnes inherited not just property, but an obligation to train someone, which implies that her skill and judgment were considered sufficient for the task. Agnes Cotillier was working as a cutler in London in 1346, and she was training her own female apprentice, a young woman known as Jussiana, a cutler, in 1346, with her own apprentice. And almost nobody today has heard of Agnes Cotillier. The third route was widowhood, which was in its strange way the most reliable path to professional independence for a medieval woman. Let me explain the legal framework, because it matters more than it might appear. Under the law of coverture, a doctrine embedded in medieval English and much of European law, a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed into her husband's. She could not independently own property, enter contracts, or conduct business in her own name. Whatever she earned or made or ran was legally his. The husband's authority was not merely social custom, it was statute. But widowhood changed everything. When a husband died, a widow acquired something approaching legal personhood. She could inherit the workshop. She could inherit the guild membership with rights to use her husband's standing as a part member of the guild, provided she had a competent journeyman to do the craft work involved. She could take on apprentices in her own name. She could conduct business, manage debts, negotiate with suppliers. The window was narrow. The pressure to remarry was enormous, not just social but economic, since widowhood's legal protections depended on remaining a widow. The moment she remarried, her new husband's coverture applied, and her independence collapsed again. Some women navigated this by choosing not to remarry at all. Alice Claver, a silk woman in 15th century London whose records have survived in some detail, was widowed in 1456. She ran her workshop for 30 years of widowhood-trained apprentices, managed a bustling household that included servants and poor children she had taken in out of charity, and in her will named a younger silk woman named Catherine Champion as her heir, deliberately passing the business to another woman rather than allowing it to dissolve. 30 years. By choice. Because the alternative, remarriage, coverture and visibility, was less appealing than running her own business while the law permitted it. The London silkwomen deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most organised and politically sophisticated examples of women's craft work in the medieval English record. Silk work in medieval London. The manufacturing of silk thread, the weaving of ribbons and braids, the production of elaborate trimmings and narrow wares was dominated by women. Not simply populated by women, dominated, mastered, passed from mistress to apprentice in a chain of knowledge transmission that functioned exactly like a guild without ever having formally organised as one. The silk women of London had what medieval documents called a mystery, a body of shared professional knowledge transmitted through a structured apprenticeship system. Young women came from across England to be trained in Cheapside and Soper Lane. The training was recognised as skilled. The work was economically significant, supplying silk goods to the nobility and the church. And in 1455 these women did something that requires a moment to fully appreciate. They petitioned Parliament. Not their guild, they had no guild. Not their husbands, they acted as an independent body. They went directly to the highest legislative authority in England and complained that Lombard merchants were importing silk goods of inferior quality, undercutting the English market and damaging their trade. Parliament listened. Parliament passed the Importation Act of 1455, which prohibited the importation of the specific silk goods in question. The silk women petitioned 4 times between 1455 and 1484, and won most of what they asked for. Women who had no formal guild, no guildmaster status, no legal standing as professional equals, these women convinced the Parliament of England to pass legislation protecting their trade. 4 times. That is not a footnote. That is not a detail. That is collective political action by women who understood their own economic importance and were not afraid to assert it through the highest available channel. Now I want to spend a moment on Catherine Lefebvre because her story is the one that personally floors me every time. In the summer of 1346, the Tower of London was operating as a military hub for England's coming campaign against France, a campaign that would culminate at the Battle of Crécy. The tower's forge was running continuously, producing hinges, window bars, locks, keys for prisoners of war, arrowheads, horseshoes, lance points, and crossbow quarrels. Everything the campaign needed that was made of iron. The master smith responsible for this production was Catherine Lefebvre, not standing in for someone, not temporarily filling a gap while the real smith was fetched. Appointed by royal authority King Edward III to run the tower's forge and carry on its work. Her son Andrew, who had inherited the position from his father Master Walter Lefebvre, had been called away for the same military expedition. Catherine took over. She was paid 8 pence a day rather than the standard 12, which historians attribute to the gender bias of the period and possibly to the understanding that she was overseeing the work rather than physically swinging every hammer herself. The pay gap was real, and it was wrong, but the appointment itself, the royal acknowledgement that Catherine Lefebvre was competent to run the forge of the Tower of London in time of war, that tells you what the people who actually knew her thought of her capabilities. And if you're wondering whether this was a coincidence, a one-off, an anomaly too small to mean anything in the same year, 1346 15th century tax records from Montpellier in southern France reference a female blacksmith listed in the documents as a fabressa, a woman blacksmith documented by name, paying taxes in her own right, practicing the trade that most history books tell us women almost never did. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to overcorrect. It would be easy to take these extraordinary women, Johanna Hill, Catherine Lefebvre, Alice Claver, the silk women of London, Agnes Cotillier, and her apprentice Euseana, and use them to argue that medieval women had equal professional standing with men. They did not. The legal structures were stacked against them. The guild system was administered by men, and often actively hostile to female competition. The pressure to define women's identity through marital status rather than occupation was relentless and real, but not equal is a very different thing from absent. And for a very long time the historical narrative of medieval craftwork said women were absent from the professional sphere. That is not what the documents say when you look carefully. The documents say women were present, skilled, organised, and sometimes extraordinarily capable, and the institutional world around them spent enormous energy, ensuring they would be minimised, marginalised, and eventually forgotten. The forgetting was not passive. It was structured. Women were classified by marital status, not occupation. Their work appeared in guild records mainly through fines, warnings, and restrictions, because those were the moments when they became visible to the male-administered bureaucracy. The positive record of their labour, the daily management, the skill transmission, the production, mostly went unwritten because it was not considered legally significant, which means that every time we find them in a tax record, a will, a petition, a royal appointment, a surviving bell with a lozenge above the maker's mark, we are recovering something that the record itself tried to bury. Here is the question I keep coming back to, and I want to share it with you because I think it is worth sitting with. How many Johanna Hills are there whose bells still ring in towers and whose names we have never recovered? How many Agnes Cotillas, trained apprentices whose work went into the world under a master's name? How many women ran workshops for 30 years of widowhood and left the whole thing to the next woman in line quietly, without any of it making it into the books that later became history? We will never fully know. The documents that would tell us were either never created or did not survive or were read by people who were not looking for what they contained. What we do know is this: the medieval workshop was not a place where one sex worked and the other waited. It was a shared enterprise, unequally credited, unequally compensated, unequally protected by law, but shared in the actual physical reality of daily life. The bread that fed the household came partly from her management. The accounts that kept the business solvent were often kept in her hand. The apprentices who went out into the world carrying the craft's knowledge had sometimes been trained by her. The craft belonged to both of them. The record belonged to one. Thomas's workshop in Cologne received its first female journeyman in 1438. A woman named Elsbeth, trained originally as a wood carver, who'd spent 3 years working in workshops in Basel and Strasbourg, and arrived with a Lehrbrief and a manner that made clear she was not interested in discussion of whether she should be there. She was there for 6 months. She taught Thomas something about a jointing technique she'd absorbed in Strasbourg that he had never encountered. When she left, moving on to the next stop on a circuit that was technically not supposed to include her, he spent the next several weeks trying to reproduce what she had shown him. He eventually managed it. He incorporated it into everything he built thereafter. Her name appears in his workshop record because he kept careful accounts. Nowhere else. The women were in the workshops all along. They built the medieval craft world alongside the men in the spaces that law and custom left open, and sometimes in spaces where they were not supposed to be at all. And yet, for all the complexity of their position, the legal constraints, the guild hostility, the pressure of coverture and remarriage, they persisted. They organised. They petitioned Parliament. They rang bells across the south of England for decades and stamped their mark on the metal. Now the guild that protected all of this and exploited all of this and eventually began strangling the very craftsmen it was meant to serve, that is a reckoning that has been waiting since the beginning of this story. And that is where we are going next. Every institution that genuinely serves people contains within itself the seeds of its own betrayal. This is not cynicism. It is just what happens when human beings with competing interests get organized. The medieval guild is perhaps the clearest example in all of economic history of an institution that started as one thing, and slowly, without any single moment of dramatic transformation, became something rather different. It did not rot suddenly. It curdled the way milk curdles almost imperceptibly until one day the thing you reached for is not what you thought it was. We have spent this entire story talking about what the guild gave to the medieval craftsman protection standards, training community professional identity, a path through the wilderness of apprenticeship, and wandering into the relative stability of mastery. All of that was real. All of it mattered. But tonight we need to talk about the other half, the part that the guild's own promotional documents did not mention. Understand first what the guild actually was by the late medieval period, In its earliest incarnations from roughly the 11th and 12th centuries onward, a craft guild was a relatively simple mutual protection arrangement. A group of craftsmen working the same trade in the same town who found it useful to present a unified front on questions of pricing, quality and training. There was genuine solidarity in this, genuine collective interest, the kind of organisation that forms when people who do similar work realise that they have more power together than they do scattered. But guilds did not stay simple. They grew, and as they grew, they accumulated something that organisations always accumulate when they become sufficiently powerful, the ability to define the rules under which other people had to live. By the 13th and 14th centuries in major European towns, belonging to a guild was not a choice. It was a legal requirement. If you wished to practice a trade within a city, any trade from baking to blacksmithing to brewing, you had to be a guild member. And only masters were full guild members, which meant that the masters of each guild controlled with the force of law behind them access to the entire economic life of the city. Think about what that means in practice, not as an abstract principle, as a daily reality. A young craftsman who had completed his wandering years produced his masterpiece and applied for master status was not simply asking to be recognized as skilled. He was asking for permission to earn a living in his own city. If the guild said no, he had no recourse. He could appeal sometimes to the town council, but the town councils by this period in many cities were themselves dominated by guild masters, which made the appeal only marginally more effective than asking your landlord to rule on a dispute with your landlord. The single most consequential abuse of the guild system, the one that historians have returned to again and again because it shaped everything else, was the manipulation of master numbers. Guilds across Europe developed over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries the practice of limiting how many master craftsmen could operate in a given area. The stated justification was market stability. Too many masters chasing too few customers would drive prices down, damage quality, and destabilize the trade. This is not entirely wrong as an argument. There is real tension between competition and sustainability in any skilled craft market, but the practice was easily and regularly used for something else entirely. Research into late medieval Flanders, where the guild records are unusually detailed, found that in some trades, less than 25% of all apprentices who entered the system ever achieved master status. 3 out of 4 people who started down this path gave years of their youth to it, wandered the roads of Europe learning the trade, produced a masterpiece. 3 out of 4 of them ended up as permanent journeymen, employees for life, skilled, qualified, experienced craftsmen who would never open their own workshops, never train their own apprentices, never have a vote in the guild meetings that governed their working lives. This was not primarily because they lacked skill. It was because the existing masters had found that limiting entry was good for business. Fewer competitors meant higher prices. More dependent journeymen meant more reliable, cheap labour. The guild's official purpose was the elevation of craft quality. Its operational reality in many times and places was the maintenance of a cartel. There is a document from Florence in the mid-14th century that captures this with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable. Florence's textile industry was enormous. The cloth-making guild, the Arte della Lana, controlled roughly 30,000 workers in a single city. But within that industry a sharp divide had developed. At the top were the wealthy master craftsmen and the merchant families who had organized themselves into the Arti Maggiori, the major guilds. Below them were the minor guilds of small artisans. And at the bottom, unrepresented by any guild at all, were the ciompi, the wool carders, the spinners, the lowest paid textile workers who did the most physically demanding work and received the least protection. The ciompi had no guild, which meant they had no legal right to form associations, no recourse against wage manipulation, no participation in the political structures that governed the city. They worked as one historical account records for 16 to 18 hours a day at fixed wages often held below subsistence level. Their wages could be withheld to cover supposed waste or damage to raw materials. In 1345, 10 wool workers who had organised an association to press for better conditions were executed, and then in June of 1378 the Ciompi revolted. They took up arms, seized government buildings, and briefly for approximately 6 weeks controlled the city government of Florence and established an unprecedented degree of democratic representation that included the lowest working classes. A wool carder named Michel di Lando, one of their own, took the executive office of the city. It lasted until August 31st of 1378. On that day, the major and minor guilds closed ranks, combined their forces, and ended the experiment. The Ciompi were dispersed. Michel di Lando was removed. The old order was restored with speed and precision that made clear exactly how threatened the guild establishment had felt. The Ciompi's grievances did not disappear when their revolt was suppressed. They simply went underground, simmering beneath the surface of Florentine economic life for another generation, contributing, as historians have noted, to the support that ordinary Florentines eventually gave to the Medici family as stabilizers of order. When a city's working classes would rather be ruled by a banking dynasty than trust their own civic institutions, something has gone deeply wrong with those institutions. Florence was not alone in its tensions. Across Europe in the 14th century, guild politics produced eruptions of organized conflict that historians have collectively called the Zunftrevolution, the Guild Revolution. In German and Swiss cities, guild craftsmen rose against the patrician merchant families who had controlled city governments for generations, demanding that craft guild masters have seats on city councils and votes in civic decisions. In Cologne, after more than a century of struggle between craft guilds and the ruling elite, a new constitution was established in 1396 that gave guild masters a majority of the seats on the city council. The Wool Weavers' Guild emerged as the single most powerful political body in one of the most important cities in medieval Germany. In Zurich in 1336, a man named Rudolf Brunn organized the city's craftsmen and overthrew the aristocratic council that had governed the city since 1234. The new constitution he established gave the 13 craft guilds equal representation with the old patriciate on the city council. Rudolf Brunn made himself the first independent mayor of Zurich, a title he held until his death in 1360. These were genuine political revolutions, bloodless, or nearly so, driven by craftsmen who had decided that the system that was supposed to protect their interests had become the primary obstacle to those interests. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. The same guild system that began as craftsmen, organizing to protect themselves against outside power, had itself become in many places the outside power that a new generation of craftsmen needed to organize against. The wheel turns. Beyond the direct political conflicts, the guild system produced another kind of damage that was quieter but perhaps longer lasting. Guilds across Europe were frequently and explicitly hostile to technological innovation. Not in all cases, and not uniformly, historians debate the degree and the specific mechanisms, and the picture is genuinely complex. But the pattern is real enough when a new technique or a new tool threatened the existing methods that guildmasters had spent decades mastering. Guilds had a documented tendency to resist it. The logic is understandable even if the consequence is unfortunate. A master whose entire professional identity was built around a particular technique had an obvious interest in ensuring that technique remained the standard. A guild whose monopoly on a trade depended on the specialization of that trade had an interest in keeping that specialization specialized. Innovation from this perspective was not progress, it was competition with a new face. In the textile industries of Northern Europe, guild regulation created what economists later described as a system of rent-seeking the extraction of value, not by producing better goods, but by controlling access to the market. Weavers' guilds in some regions maintained limits on loom numbers per workshop that prevented any individual master from scaling up production, even when demand was increasing and the technology to meet it existed. The practical effect was to suppress output, maintain artificially high prices and protect incumbent masters from the competition of more efficient peers. The printing press, when it arrived in the mid-15th century, encountered scribes' guilds and copyists' associations that initially attempted to treat it as an infringement on their trade. The guilds that controlled manuscript production in the early decades of printing were not simply traditional. They were structured economic interests trying to slow down a technology that was going to make much of their specialized knowledge suddenly irrelevant. They failed. The press won. But the attempt illustrates something important. By the late medieval period, the guild's capacity for institutional conservatism had become a structural feature of European economic life. I want to be careful here because the temptation is to reduce this to a simple morality play. The guild started good and turned bad. That is too neat. The guild system also genuinely trained craftsmen, genuinely maintained quality standards, genuinely provided welfare support for sick and widowed members, genuinely gave ordinary working people collective political power they would not otherwise have had. The Cologne weavers who won majority seats on their city council in 1396 were not the villains of this story. They are craftsmen who had fought for political representation for over a century and finally got it. The corruption of the guild was not the corruption of people who were evil. It was the corruption of people who were successful, who had built something that worked well enough to become powerful enough to begin working primarily for itself. This is a distinction worth making because we have seen versions of it in every century since. Professional associations that begin as protection for practitioners and gradually become protection of practitioners from accountability. Licensing requirements that start as quality standards and end as barriers to entry. The medieval guild did not invent rent-seeking behavior. It just provided a particularly clear and historically documented example of how quickly any institution of collective defense can slide toward collective exploitation. And yet, and this is the part I keep returning to because it matters even within the corruption, even within the cartelism and the political maneuvering and the suppression of the chompai and the blockage of new technology, the craft itself survived. The journeymen who never became masters still made things, still maintained the standards because their reputation depended on it, even if their institutional standing did not. Still passed knowledge to the next generation formally or informally through the workshop relationships that the guild regulated but could not fully control. The women who ran workshops in technical violation of guild restrictions still produced goods that the market valued and customers sought. The silk women of London who had no guild still transmitted their mystery from mistress to apprentice, still petitioned Parliament, still made the silk work that the nobility bought. The craft, in other words, was larger than the institution. It preceded the guild, and in various forms it outlasted the guild. The knowledge lived in bodies and in workshops, and in the quiet daily repetition of skilled work, and no amount of institutional dysfunction could fully extinguish it. William's workshop, the blacksmith in Troy, who has been our companion through this entire story, was affected by all of this, though not always visibly. He paid his guild dues. He submitted to inspections. He navigated the informal politics of the guild meeting with the caution of someone who understood that the difference between a productive relationship with the guild master and an antagonistic one was not simply a matter of skill. He had seen a journeyman from a neighbouring workshop wait 6 years for a master slot that never materialised despite producing excellent work, because the existing masters had quietly decided the market in their section of town was full. He had seen what happened when someone pushed back too directly. He did not push back directly. He worked. He maintained the standards. He trained his apprentice as well as he could. He made the things the town needed and put them into the world with the small mark that identified his forge, and trusted that the mark and the quality behind it would speak for themselves. That is in the end what most craftsmen did. They worked within the system, accommodated its contradictions, and held to the parts of it that genuinely served their purposes, while quietly ignoring the parts that did not, as long as the ignoring could be done quietly. It was not heroism. It was not resignation. It was the practical wisdom of people who understood that they could not change the entire structure of medieval professional life, but who could control what came out of their own forge. And after a day that began before the sun worked through the mid-morning inspection, broke for bread and ale and a moment's rest, and continued into the soft light of late afternoon, that was what William did. He worked. And when the light finally failed and the forge cooled and the workshop fell quiet, that was when the private life began. The part of a medieval craftsman's existence that nobody recorded, and few historians have tried to recover. The hours after sunset that were in their own way as revealing as everything that came before. That is where we go next. The shutters close. The fire in the forge dies down to embers. The last customer of the day has gone, and the last piece of iron has cooled past the point where it can be worked. William's workday is over. But here is the thing about the private life of a medieval craftsman that I find genuinely astonishing, and I want you to hear this because it upends something that most of us have assumed without ever quite thinking about it. The boundary between William's working day and his private life was not the wall between his workshop and his home. It was the wall between his workshop and the street. Everything else was all one thing. Most people, when they imagine a medieval craftsman's evening picture, something approximately like their own evening translated backward in time. Work ends, home begins. The two are separate worlds that happen to be occupied by the same person. The medieval home did not work that way. Not for craftsmen. Not for anyone in the middle ranks of urban life. The workshop was attached to the house. The family lived in the same rooms where the apprentice slept, where the materials were stored, where customers sometimes waited. The separation between commercial life and domestic life that we take entirely for granted was for most of human history a very recent and quite unusual arrangement. Before the industrial era separated the factory from the home, before office buildings pulled white-collar work out of the parlour and into a different neighbourhood, before all of that, people like William had no commute. They had no leaving work. They had a front room that was also a workshop, and a back room that was also a bedroom and a yard that might double as a storage area for materials that smelled bad enough that the guild had insisted they be kept outside. That intimacy was not only logistical, it was social, it was emotional. It was the context within which everything private happened. Every argument about money, every conversation about the apprentice's progress, every moment of genuine rest, all of it taking place in proximity to the tools and the inventory and the daily evidence of what William's working life demanded of him. So what did evenings actually look like? The guild rules that governed working hours, no labour after dark, no candlelight work, meant that once the light failed, there was genuinely nothing more to be done in the workshop, which sounds like a relief until you realise that in December, the light failed by mid-afternoon. The evening stretched long, and in a world without electric light, without screens, without the infinite distraction that modern people use to fill their hours, what filled those hours more than we usually credit? The medieval calendar was organised around saints' days and religious observances, with a comprehensiveness that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Historical estimates for medieval England suggest that between Sundays and the various feast days of the church calendar, a craftsman might have somewhere between 80 and 150 days off work per year, not counting the winter evenings that were too dark for productive labour. Some estimates go higher, suggesting that the medieval worker enjoyed more leisure time calculated annually than a modern full-time employee. This surprises people. The romantic image of the suffering medieval labourer ground down by relentless toil is not entirely wrong. The physical demands of the work were real, the risks were real, the poverty was real. But the time structure was genuinely different from what followed it. Industrialization did not simply give workers better pay and safer conditions. In many documented cases, it also took away the feast days, the seasonal rhythms, and the long winter evenings that pre-industrial workers had filled with their own activities. The guild feast days were among the most important social events of the year. Several times annually, depending on the trade and the city, the guild organized communal meals that were genuinely elaborate affairs: ale and wine, roasted meats, fish, spiced dishes, entertainment provided by musicians or storytellers. The Chaucer stories we still read today were the kind of stories that circulated at gatherings exactly like these. Not highbrow literature, communal entertainment, bawdy and funny and sometimes heartbreaking, designed for groups of people who'd been doing physical labour all day and wanted something that could hold attention without requiring sustained quiet concentration. One of the more underappreciated facts about medieval social life is how fundamentally communal it was. We're accustomed to entertainment designed for individuals experienced alone or in small groups of chosen people. Medieval entertainment was almost entirely the other kind stories told to groups, music played for rooms full of people, games requiring multiple participants, feasts at long tables where the food was as much a backdrop as the reason to gather. The tavern occupied a position in medieval urban life that had no precise modern equivalent. It was simultaneously a public house, a meeting room, an informal credit market, an employment exchange, and a social venue that cut across class lines more freely than almost any other institution. A journeyman who needed to find work would go to the tavern masters. Looking for temporary help would go to the same tavern. Deals were made there. Information moved through those rooms, and by all available historical evidence, significant amounts of ale were consumed. The guild rules, interestingly, had opinions about tavern attendance. Apprentices were forbidden from visiting taverns. It was specifically enumerated in the indenture contracts we discussed so many evenings ago. Masters were generally expected to maintain a certain dignity. But the journeymen, who were neither fully bound nor entirely free, occupied a kind of grey zone in the social regulation of evening life. And if the tone of complaints from guildmasters about the comportment of their journeymen in the historical record is any indication that grey zone was frequently and enthusiastically inhabited, now, here is the detail about medieval private life that I genuinely could not stop thinking about for days after I first encountered it. Medieval people did not sleep the way we sleep. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal, documented, historically recoverable fact about the structure of human nights before artificial lighting reorganized them. A historian named Roger E. Kirch, who spent decades combing through court records, letters, diaries, medical texts, literary references, and philosophical writings from across pre-industrial Europe, discovered something extraordinary hiding in plain sight in the sources. References, casual, matter-of-fact, references, the kind that appear when something is so normal it doesn't require explanation to first sleep and second sleep. Medieval people went to bed when darkness fell, typically around 9 o'clock, varying with the season. They slept for approximately 4 hours. Then they woke. Not because something was wrong, not because they were ill or anxious or disturbed. They woke because their bodies told them to in the naturally dark and quiet middle of the night. And then for an hour or two they were simply awake. This period, which the sources call the watch, was not dead time. It was in the description that Kirch compiled from hundreds of historical references a time for reflection, for prayer, for conversation with whoever else was awake in the same room, for the kind of intimate, unhurried thought that daylight hours filled with the demands of work and children and customers did not permit. Court records specify events in relation to first sleep and second sleep, the way we might specify things in relation to noon or midnight. Medical texts recommended activities appropriate to the watch period. Chaucer referenced it in the Canterbury Tales without explanation, which tells you that his 14th century audience needed no explanation. It was simply how nights worked, and then around midnight or 1 in the morning people returned to sleep. Their second sleep lasted until dawn. Chronobiologists studying this pattern in the 21st century have found that it corresponds with the natural human tendency toward biphasic sleep. 2 sleep periods separated by wakefulness that only the widespread adoption of artificial lighting appears to have disrupted. The modern 8-hour continuous sleep that we treat as normal is in historical terms a recent innovation. Before electric light extended the evening and made late waking possible, human sleep was structured differently, and the structure it followed was, it turns out, genuinely healthy, aligned with the body's natural rhythms in a way that industrial-era sleep schedules may not be. This is either deeply reassuring or deeply inconvenient depending on how you feel about the idea that everything you thought you knew about sleep was invented in the 19th century. What did William do during his watch? Probably on most nights something small and practical. Stoke the fire so the house did not lose too much heat before dawn. Check on the apprentice. Think through the orders waiting for the next morning, in the way that minds freed from the demands of active attention sometimes clarify what daytime busyness obscures. Perhaps pray the church's night office a short private prayer, the kind of observance that cost nothing and took only a few minutes, but that connected the watcher to the larger rhythm of religious time. Sometimes perhaps he and his wife talked, really talked the kind of conversation that daylight hours crowded out. About money, yes, because there was always the question of money, but also about the children, about the apprentice whose progress or lack thereof was a matter of genuine concern, about what the guild meeting next week was likely to produce, and whether the new regulation being discussed would affect the workshop, about whether the daughter was going to be apprenticed to the silkwork trade or something else. The conversations that built a life together conducted in whispers in the dark while the rest of the house slept. Let me ask you something, and I ask this as genuinely as I know how because I think it touches something that matters. When was the last time you were awake in the middle of the night, genuinely awake and not distressed about it, and used that time for something other than looking at a screen? Because what strikes me about the medieval watch, that quiet hour between first sleep and second sleep, is not that it was medically superior or culturally superior. It is that it was accepted as a natural part of how time worked. Nobody thought it was a problem. Nobody was lying there counting the hours until morning, calculating how much sleep they had left, spiraling into anxiety about the anxiety about sleep. It was just the watch. You woke up. You existed quietly for a while. You went back to sleep. There is something in that I find genuinely beautiful, and I suspect I am not the only one. The rest of the private life, the parts that did not involve sleep or the tavern or the feast days, was the texture of ordinary domesticity in a pre-modern world. Children in medieval urban families were present and involved in the household economy from early ages. Not in a way that would be acceptable. Now there are genuine horrors in the historical record about child labour and early responsibility, but in a way that also created a kind of integration between childhood and adult life that we have lost and sometimes romanticize without quite acknowledging what we are romanticizing. A craftsman's child grew up watching the craft, absorbing its rhythms and its materials and its sounds before they could articulate what any of it meant. Some of them would become apprentices formally contractually to their own father or to another master. Some would find their way into entirely different trades. A surprising number in the historical record left the craft entirely for the church or for trade, or for whatever other path presented itself in a world that was, despite its rigidities, not entirely without movement. The wife managed the household with an authority that formal records rarely acknowledged, but that everyone in the actual household understood as real. She held the keys literally in many medieval illustrations and inventories, the keys to the various chests and cupboards that secured the household supplies and small valuables. She kept the accounts frequently, or at least maintained the mental accounting that the workshop's financial health depended on. When the master was sick or away, she ran the operation, not theoretically, actually. Religion threaded through all of it in ways that are difficult to fully convey to a modern secular audience, without either romanticizing or condescending. For William, faith was not a compartment of life. It was the structure within which life occurred. The church bell marked the hours. The saints' days organized the year. The guild maintained an altar in the local church and expected its members to participate in the religious observances associated with it, the feast day of the patron saint, the procession, the communal prayer. This was not entirely separate from the economic life of the guild. It was woven through it. The guild's charitable activities, its support for sick members, its funding of funerals for those who died without the means to afford them. These were organized through the same devotional framework that the religious observances expressed. The faith was communal. It was experienced with other people in shared ritual in the physical gathering that the medieval church required, which meant that even the most private, most devotional aspect of William's life was connected to the same community network that his professional life depended on. There was no separating them. The blacksmith and the parishioner were the same person, observed by the same people, accountable to the same judgments. The fire is very low now. The workshop is dark. The apprentice is asleep near the hearth, twitching slightly in whatever young people dream about when they are 14, and tired and still have years of learning ahead of them. William has gone to his first sleep. Sometime around midnight, we might as well say around midnight since the historical evidence suggests it, as roughly the typical watch hour he will wake. He will lie in the dark for a while. He will think about tomorrow's iron supply, about the door hinge the church needs by the end of the week, about little Marjorie who has a cough that has been going on longer than he likes, and then he will sleep again until the sky outside the shuttered window begins its slow transition from black to the deep blue of pre-dawn, until the forge needs to be lit again, until another day begins in exactly the way that yesterday began, and the day before that, and the day before that. The routine, the practice, the accumulated weight of days that build without anyone quite noticing into a life. We have spent so much time inside that life, inside the workshop and the guild and the road and the masterpiece and the evening and the watch, that it is worth stepping back just for a moment before we move forward. Because the next thing we need to see is what this world made. Not just the physical objects, the locks and the bells and the cloth, but the larger thing, the legacy that the medieval craft worker left behind in the fabric of the world we still live in buildings that are still standing, and institutions that are still shaping how we think about skill and knowledge and work. Some of what was built is still literally above our heads. In April of 2019, a fire broke out in the roof of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and the world watched. Hundreds of millions of people, most of whom had never visited Paris, many of whom had no particular connection to the Catholic Church, quite a few of whom would have described themselves as entirely secular, sat in front of their screens and watched an 800-year-old building burn, and something unexpected happened to them. They grieved. Strangers were weeping in the streets of Paris. People were standing in silence outside French embassies in cities they had never left. The image of the spire collapsing through the smoke was shared hundreds of millions of times in a single night. And the next morning, before the embers had cooled, before any damage assessment had been conducted, donations for the reconstruction were already flowing in from across the world. Within a week, more than 800 million euros had been pledged. Why, a building burned. Buildings burn. This was not a loss of human life. Nobody was hurt. And yet the response was not the calm, regretful acknowledgement we give most disasters. It was something rawer than that. I think the answer has something to do with what we were actually mourning when we watched that spire fall, and that answer leads us directly back to the anonymous craftsman whose work we have been tracing throughout this entire story. Let us start with something specific, because the specific always carries more weight than the general. When the French government announced its plans to restore Notre Dame, one of the first decisions they made was also one of the most unusual. They would use medieval techniques to rebuild the medieval structure. Not because modern techniques were unavailable, because the medieval techniques were better suited to working with medieval materials, and because the people overseeing the restoration had come to understand something that the original builders had understood instinctively, that a stone cathedral built over decades in the 13th century was not simply an assembly of materials, but the result of a specific dialogue between craftsmen and their medium, and that dialogue could not be replicated with power tools and modern sealants without losing something essential. So they called carpenters who knew how to use hand axes. They fashioned oak beams by hand, shaping the joints with mallet and chisel, the same joints that medieval carpenters had cut 900 years earlier. Peter Henriksen, one of the carpenters involved in the restoration, described moments during the work when he would pause with his chisel and think about the medieval carpenter who had cut basically the same joint in basically the same wood 8 or 9 centuries before him. We probably are in some ways thinking the same things, he said. That sentence is extraordinary to me. 2 craftsmen separated by 900 years of history, converging on the same problem and arriving at the same solution, because the problem, how do you join 2 heavy oak beams so that they bear weight over centuries, has one correct answer, and the medieval craftsman found it first. Notre Dame is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. Across Europe, the buildings that survive from the medieval period, the great cathedrals, the town halls, the market crosses, the bridges that are still in daily use, are standing testimony to the quality of craft work that was produced by the guild system at its best. And they are standing not because they were built of indestructible materials, but because they were built by people who understood their materials at a level of intimacy that formal engineering education has never fully replicated. The stonemason who cut the blocks for a cathedral nave did not calculate load-bearing capacity with a formula. He did not consult a textbook. He had spent years developing the feel for stone that told him from the sound of a hammer blow whether a particular piece of limestone was going to hold its shape under centuries of compressive weight, or was going to crack. That knowledge was not recorded anywhere in a form that has survived. It lived in his hands and in his judgment, and it transferred from master to apprentice so reliably that the buildings it produced are still standing, while many modern structures with formal engineering specifications have long since been demolished. The flying buttress, that elegant stone arch that leans against the exterior of a Gothic cathedral and transfers the weight of the walls outward and downward, was not the product of architectural theory. It was the product of stonemasons who were experimenting with weight and form on the job, refining the design through successive buildings until they arrived at a solution so structurally elegant that it is still used as a teaching example in modern structural engineering courses, not because it is the only way to solve the problem, because it is a beautiful way. Because the medieval craftsmen were not just solving a structural challenge, they were making something that would be worth looking at for centuries after the problem was solved, But the physical buildings are only one dimension of the legacy. There are words in your mouth right now, words that you use regularly without thinking about where they came from, that have their direct origins in the medieval craft world. The word journeyman. You know this word. You use this word. In American English, a journeyman athlete is someone competent and experienced but not elite, a player who moves from team to team, reliable and skilled, never quite the star. That meaning exists because the medieval journeyman, the craftsman who had completed his apprenticeship but not yet achieved master status, was paid by the déjeuner in French and moved between employers as work required. 800 years of usage and the word still carries in its modern meaning the shadow of the system that created it, the word masterpiece. As we have already explored, this word travelled from the regulatory language of medieval guild statutes into everyday speech, where it now describes any work of exceptional quality, but something of the original meaning persists in how we use it. We still reserve the word for work that represents the best a particular person is capable of producing. We still use it to name the achievement that stands above everything else. The guild's specific meaning has been forgotten. The emotional weight behind the word has not. The word salary, from the Latin salarium, which was payment in salt, one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient and medieval world, arrived in English through the administrative language of medieval institutions, including the contracts and records of the guild system that we have been exploring throughout this story, and apprentice, from the Latin apprehender, meaning to grasp or seize to apprehend knowledge literally through the physical act of learning by doing. The word preserves in its etymology the essential insight of the medieval guild that certain kinds of knowledge cannot be transmitted by instruction alone, that they must be grasped physically through sustained practice under guidance. The word knows something about learning that 4 centuries of formal education has been periodically rediscovering and periodically forgetting. The modern vocational training systems that exist across Europe, North America, and much of the rest of the industrialized world, the apprenticeship programs that train electricians and plumbers and carpenters, the licensing examinations that credential skilled trades, the certification systems that verify competence before someone is allowed to work independently in a skilled field, all of these trace their direct institutional lineage to the medieval guild. The 3-stage structure of apprentice, journeyman and master exists in modified form in skilled trades training programs today. In the United States, apprenticeship programs in building trades are regulated at the state and local level and typically require the same essential components. The medieval guild required supervised training under a qualified practitioner, a defined period of experience, and a demonstration of competence before independent practice is permitted. The specific forms have changed enormously. The underlying logic has not changed at all. Germany still maintains the Wanderjahr tradition in certain skilled trades, though it is now voluntary rather than mandatory. Young craftsmen in roofing, metalworking, wood carving and organ building still travel across Europe on the traditional journeyman circuit, wearing the traditional clothing that identifies their craft, carrying a walking stick, and adhering to the ancient rules that prohibit them from returning home during the wandering period. There are fewer of them every decade, but they are there, still moving, still learning, still carrying something old and particular and difficult to name through the modern world. Here is something I want to ask you, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. When you call something a masterpiece, when you say that a piece of music or a novel or a meal or a piece of woodwork or a building is a masterpiece, what are you actually saying? You're saying someone made this and everything they had learned across all the years of their life, and all the materials available to them, and all the circumstances of their particular moment in history, was brought to bear on this one thing, and the result is the best that human being could produce given all of those constraints. That is a remarkable thing to say, And it is even more remarkable when you realize that the word you're using to say it has carried that meaning, that exact meaning continuously without interruption, from the moment a medieval guild master first examined a journeyman's submitted work and pronounced it sufficient for admission. The guild master is long dead. The journeyman's workshop has been gone for centuries. The masterpiece itself may or may not survive, but the meaning lives on in the word, still doing the same work it was designed to do, still identifying the moment when a human being gives everything they have to a single act of making. I want to tell you about one more thing before we leave this part of the story, because I think it is the most quietly remarkable legacy of all. Salisbury Cathedral in England has a clock. The mechanism is not mechanical in the modern sense. It was built around the year 1386, and it is the oldest functioning mechanical clock in the world. This same clock, the same mechanism still running, still keeping time in the same cathedral in which it was installed when Richard II was on the English throne and Chaucer was writing his Canterbury Tales. It was made by a craftsman whose name we do not know, someone who belonged to a trade for which we do not even have a clear guild designation. The craft of clockmaking was still so new in England in the late 14th century that it had not yet fully organised into its own guild. He was working at the edge of what was technically possible in his time. He was solving problems that nobody had solved before, in the sense that the mechanical clock was still a relatively recent innovation in Europe, and the particular mechanisms involved were still being refined and improved across the continent. He built something that has been running continuously for nearly 640 years. Think about that in practical terms. The machine has been maintained, repaired, adjusted by craftsmen across the intervening centuries. It has not run untouched since 1386. But the fundamental mechanism has not been replaced. The core of the thing that an unknown craftsman designed and built in the late 14th century is still right now ticking in Salisbury. 640 years, no battery, no electricity, no software update required, just iron and a weight, and the accumulated understanding of how to make things that last. This is what the medieval craftsman left behind, not just buildings and objects, but the framework within which skilled work is still organised, the language through which we still describe exceptional achievement, and the proof sitting in a cathedral in Wiltshire still ticking that it is possible to make something so well that it outlasts every context that produced it. The guild is gone, the workshop is gone, the specific daily reality of William's forge and Thomas's joinery and Johanna Hill's bell foundry has dissolved into the distance of 8 centuries. What remains is the work, and there is something in that, something about what endures when everything else passes that I have been thinking about since we began this story, and that I suspect will stay with me for a long time after we are done, which means we're almost at the end now. We have followed the medieval craft worker from before sunrise to after sunset, from the moment the forge was first lit through the guild's politics, and the journeyman's road, and the masterpiece's pressure, and the watchful women behind the workshop walls. We have listened to the bells that Johanna made still ringing. We have touched the clock that an unnamed craftsman built and that is still keeping time. All that remains is to bring the whole story into focus, to ask the one question that I have been circling since the beginning, and that only becomes possible to ask now that we have spent this time inside the life. What would William think if he could see us? That is where we are going. And I promise you the answer is not what you expect. All right. You have been patient and generous, and the night has gotten long, and this is the moment the whole story has been building toward. Let us do the thought experiment properly. William our blacksmith in Troy, the one with the forge that smelled of charcoal and the daughter who runs the house, and the left thumb that never quite healed. Let us say that by some impossibility of time, he steps out of his workshop in the year 1245 and into a street in a modern American city. What does he see? Everything first. The sheer visual quantity of the modern world would be genuinely disorienting in a way that is hard to overstate. The scale of the buildings, the speed of the cars, the artificial light everywhere at all hours indoors and outdoors, warm and cold and blue-white and golden light that never fails and never dims, light that has completely decoupled human activity from the rhythm of the sun. He would know in an immediate and visceral way that this is what the Guild's prohibition on candlelight was protecting against, and he would see unmistakably that the protection had not held. He would be astonished. Let us be honest about that. Astonished by the medicine that keeps people alive past 60, past 70, past 80. Astonished by the food, the sheer variety and abundance of it available, without seasonality, without preservation, without the constant underlying anxiety about whether there would be enough. Astonished by communication, the ability to speak to someone 1,000 miles away instantly without a messenger or a letter or days of waiting. He would not be stupid about any of this. William was not stupid. He would understand that the world he was looking at had solved problems that his world had not solved, and he would respect that. He was a craftsman. He understood what it meant to make something better than the person before you had made it. But then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, he would start asking questions. His first question, I think, would be practical rather than philosophical. He would look at the objects in this world, the phones, the furniture, the tools, the kitchen appliances, the cars, and he would ask who made these. And the honest answer we would have to give him is we don't know. Not the individual person, not the workshop, not the specific human hands and specific acquired skill that shaped each piece. The answer is somewhere in a supply chain that stretches across several continents and involves hundreds of different processes and probably cannot be traced to a single identifiable maker at all. William would find this genuinely incomprehensible. Not morally incomprehensible, he was not a moralist, or at least no more than most people. Practically incomprehensible. The entire structure of his professional world, the guild mark that identified the maker, the reputation that attached to the mark, the accountability that flowed from the reputation was built on the premise that every object had a known maker, and that known maker stood behind the quality of the thing. The relationship between the craftsman and the object was not incidental. It was the mechanism by which quality was enforced. He would ask if something breaks, who do you go to? And we would say, will you throw it away and buy a new one? And he would stare at us for a long, quiet moment. His second question would be about the hands. Medieval craft culture rested on a deeply held conviction never formally articulated in quite these terms, but present in every guild regulation, every apprenticeship contract, every standard of the masterpiece that the making of things was a form of human dignity. Not the only form, not a form that overrode all other considerations, but a form. The craftsman's skill was his identity, his contribution, his place in the world. To make something well was to be something. The object was not incidental to the maker's life. It was a central expression of it. William would look at the modern world and ask, what do people make? And we would say cautiously that most people in the modern economy provide services, or manage information, or process things that someone else has already made, or operate machines that do the actual making. He would not understand this as an indictment. He was not that kind of person. But he might ask gently, not to be cruel, but because he genuinely wanted to understand whether people are satisfied with that, whether it is enough, and we would have to be honest with him. The data suggests we're not entirely satisfied. The arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century, which explicitly looked to medieval craft culture as its model, was a direct response to what industrialization had taken away, the sense that the objects in a person's home were connected to human skill and intention. John Ruskin and William Morris, writing in the 1860s and 1870s, described the factory-made object as a kind of moral desolation, and while that framing overstates the case, it was pointing at something real. More recently, the explosion of interest in handmade goods in artisan food and craft brewing and pottery classes and woodworking workshops, all of it represents a reaching across centuries back towards something that the industrial world dissolved. The historian Glenn Adamson, who spent his career studying craft, put it plainly, the first factories did not simply speed up existing production methods. They reorganized making according to entirely different principles. What they reorganized away was the relationship between the maker and the made. And we have been in various ways trying to recover pieces of that relationship ever since. William would recognize what we were reaching for. He lived it every day. His third question, and here is where the thought experiment gets genuinely uncomfortable, would be about time. We have already established that the medieval craftsman calculated across a full year had more days off than most modern full-time employees. We have talked about the feast days, the saints' days, the rhythm of work and rest that was built into the calendar. We have talked about the watch, the hour between first sleep and second sleep that was simply accepted as part of how nights worked. William would look at modern life and ask, when do you stop? And the honest answer, the one that most people listening to this right now would recognize in their own experience, is not often. Not really. Not in a way that the body and the mind fully accept as stopping. The phone in the pocket ensures that work never quite ends. The artificial light ensures that there is always something more that could be done. The economic structure of modern professional life applies a continuous, ambient pressure that medieval guild culture explicitly designed its calendar to interrupt. William had a forge. When the light failed, the forge closed. The day ended not because he chose to end it, but because the world ended it for him. There was no negotiating with the sun. The boundary was physical, non-negotiable, and enforced by nature itself. We have no such boundary, and it shows. I'm not suggesting that we trade our healthcare and our food security for the privilege of having our working hours determined by the sunset. That would be a foolish trade. But I find it worth sitting with, really sitting with, not just nodding at the idea that the medieval craftsman's relationship with the end of the day was in some ways healthier than ours, that the rule against candlelight was protecting something that we gave away without quite meaning to. What would William most pity about us? I think he would pity us our disconnection from the things we own. He knew every object in his house, knew where it came from, how it had been made, roughly what it had cost in materials and labour, and approximately how long it should last before it needed repair. He knew his tools the way you know a close friend, their history, their particular qualities, their vulnerabilities. He had a relationship with his physical world that was active, not passive. He was not a consumer of objects. He was a maker and a keeper of them. Most of us are consumers. We buy things we cannot repair, use them until they break, and replace them with things that will also break. We have offloaded the relationship with the physical world to supply chains and delivery systems and customer service departments. And the result is a kind of helplessness with material things that would, I think, genuinely distress a medieval craftsman to witness. In 1483, a document from the Coventry Guild of Cappers, the hatmakers described the proper relationship between a craftsman and his work in terms that I have never forgotten. He that will be counted a workman must take his work as his own child. Your work as your own child. With that comes the fierce pride, the constant worry, the willingness to sacrifice sleep for its sake, and the absolute certainty that its quality reflects directly on you. We have largely abandoned that relationship. We have outsourced it, and something real was lost in the outsourcing even if much else was gained. Here is what William would admire about us: the medicine. He would be astonished and moved by the medicine. His daughter's cough, little Marjorie with the cough that had been going on longer than he liked, would be treated in a single visit to a clinic and forgotten within a week. The losses that shaped medieval life with a regularity we can barely imagine: the child who died at 3, the wife who died in childbirth, the journeyman who lost 3 fingers to a forge accident and never worked again. These would be in our world. Manageable, preventable, survivable. He would admire the communication, the ability to reach the silk women in London, or the glass blowers in Murano, or the joiners in Florence within seconds, without a messenger, without days of delay. He had spent years on a road that those conversations could now replace. He would admire the abundance. Not without some wariness. He was a careful man with money, as any craftsman who had run a workshop on tight margins needed to be, but genuine admiration. The fact that the hard years, the years of bad harvest and disease and shortage that haunted the medieval calendar, were no longer the structure within which everyone lived. That would seem to him like an unambiguous achievement of civilization. And he would admire, perhaps most of all, the choice. In William's world, your trade was largely determined by your family, your circumstance, your geography. The range of lives available to you was narrow. The modern world's extraordinary and sometimes overwhelming proliferation of possible paths of careers and educations and identities would seem to him not a source of anxiety but a gift, a version of freedom that his world could not have imagined and that he would have wanted desperately for his children. So what does the thought experiment leave us with the craftsman who would be astonished by our achievements and troubled by our losses? Who would recognize in us the same human hunger for meaningful work that drove him to the forge before dawn? Who would see in the modern longing for handmade things, for artisan bread and craft beer and pottery classes and sourdough starters, the reaching of a species trying to recover something it gave away in exchange for convenience? Who would probably want more than anything to fix something? He would look around at all the things we own that we cannot repair, and his hands would itch. He would want to understand how the phone worked, not because he would trust himself to fix it, but because he had spent his entire life working on the principle that you should understand the things you depend on. That mystery and dependence were not the same thing. That knowing how something was made was a form of respect toward the person who made it. And he might leave us with a question not confrontational, not superior, just practical, the way craftsmen tend to be. The question would be, what do you make not as a job, not as a profession? Just, is there anything in your life that you have made with your own hands that carries your mark, that will last beyond your immediate use of it, that represents what you know and what you can do when you bring everything you have learned to bear on a single task? It is a gentle question, but it is not a small one. We have spent a long time in William's world tonight. We have followed him from the darkness before dawn, through the lighting of the forge and the rhythm of the morning, through the midday transactions and the afternoon steady work. We have watched young apprentices arrive and give years of their lives to learning. We have followed journeymen onto roads that stretched across all of medieval Europe, carrying knowledge from workshop to workshop like seeds. We have stood in the room where the masterpiece was judged. We have listened to Johanna Hill's bells still ringing 800 years after she made them. We have watched an unnamed craftsman's clock still ticking in Salisbury. We have followed the guild through its finest hours and its worst. We have met the women history forgot to write down who made things anyway. We have sat at the midday table and eaten bread and pottage, and listened to the market gossip that served as professional intelligence. We have woken in the dark for the watch and thought quietly about the day ahead and slept again. And at the end of all of it, what I hope you take away, the thing that I kept coming back to all the way through the research and the writing and the thinking that went into this story, is not admiration for a lost golden age. It is simpler than that. It is the recognition that the people who built the medieval world were not so different from us. They were not more noble or more pure or more spiritually in touch with the earth. They were people with bills to pay and children to worry about, and colleagues who were sometimes infuriating, and mornings when everything went wrong. They were people who had good days at the forge and bad days, who made something excellent on one occasion and something mediocre the next and knew the difference, and cared about the difference. They were in the deepest sense us, working under different constraints with different tools in a world where the line between survival and its absence was much closer than it is for most people listening to this now, but recognizably, essentially stubbornly human. And they made beautiful things. They made things that are still above our heads, still ringing in towers, still keeping time. That, I think, is what we were actually mourning when we watched Notre Dame burn. We were mourning the world that made it. Thank you. I mean that as directly and genuinely as I know how. Thank you for spending this time here, for letting this story be the thing that kept you company tonight rather than something louder and faster and easier to consume. These stories take a great deal of care to build, and the fact that you chose to listen to the end of this one means more to me than I have words for. If this journey through the medieval workshop stirred something in you, a curiosity, a question, a memory of something you once made with your hands and had forgotten about, I would love to know. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you will think about the next time you hold something old and well made and realize that someone cared. If you have not yet subscribed and you found value in this story, please consider it. Every subscriber is someone who has decided that history told carefully is worth their time, and that decision is what makes it possible to keep doing this work at all. The next story is already taking shape, and if this one surprised you, I think the next one will too. There are so many lives that history has not told properly, so many rooms we've not yet entered, so many mornings before dawn, when someone was already awake, already working, already making the world without anyone thinking to write their name down. Those are the stories I want to tell, and I will see you for the next one whenever the night finds you ready. Sleep well.